Tonight, as you drift into slumber, let the darkest chapters of Roman history carry you into dreams. While most people count sheep, you'll be counting the catastrophic reigns of Rome's most depraved rulers. Men who turned the marble halls of power into chambers of madness, cruelty, and spectacular failure. From Caligula's descent into murderous insanity to Nero's burning obsession with destruction, these aren't just bedtime stories. They're the real nightmares that haunted an empire for centuries. Each emperor we'll explore tonight wielded absolute power and used it to unleash chaos. That would make your worst dreams seem peaceful by comparison. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the gentle cadence of ancient Roman corruption lull you to sleep. Because sometimes, the most twisted tales of human nature are exactly what we need to hear in the quiet hours of the night. Let's begin our journey through Rome's Hall of Imperial Horrors. Our story starts in the year 37 CE, a time nearly 2,000 years ago, when the world was held in the firm, disciplined grasp of the Roman Empire. This was not merely a nation, but a sprawling, multicultural behemoth, a testament to human ambition, engineering, and military might. Its influence stretched across continents, a colossal tapestry woven with threads of conquest and civilization. From the misty, rain-swept green hills of Britannia, where legionaries stood sentinel against the wild tribes of the north, to the golden, sun-scorched sands of Egypt, where ancient traditions bowed to the might of a new master, Rome's authority was absolute. This dominion wasn't maintained by force alone. It was a sophisticated system of control. An intricate network of stone-paved roads, marvels of engineering, stitched the disparate provinces together, allowing for the rapid movement of armies, goods, and information. Legions, the most formidable fighting force the world had ever known, were stationed at strategic points, a constant, visible reminder of Roman power. And beneath it all was the bedrock of Roman law, a complex and comprehensive legal framework that brought a semblance of order and justice to millions of diverse peoples. In this great and terrible empire, in a seaside villa at Antium, a child was born. His name was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a grand, almost burdensome name for a small, helpless baby. It was a name that carried the weight of history, of a noble and fiercely proud lineage. The Ahenobarbi, meaning bronze-bearded, were an ancient plebeian family that had risen to prominence, known for their fiery tempers and political influence. But this child's heritage was far more complex and dangerous than that of a typical Roman aristocrat. He was born into the very heart of the imperial family, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a bloodline that was as much a poisoned chalice as it was a crown. This was a family where power and peril were inextricably linked, where the path to glory was paved with the bones of rivals, and where even the closest relatives could be the deadliest of enemies. His mother was Agrippina the Younger, a woman of formidable intelligence, unyielding will, and boundless ambition. She was not merely a noblewoman. She was a direct descendant of the deified Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Her veins pulsed with the blood of conquerors and rulers. She had witnessed firsthand the brutal, unforgiving nature of imperial politics. Her own mother had been starved to death, her brothers executed or exiled. Agrippina had learned from a young age that survival in the Julio-Claudian court required a sharp mind, a ruthless heart, and an unquenchable thirst for power. She was a woman who had been forged in the crucible of loss and betrayal, and she was determined that her son would not suffer the same fate as her fallen family members. The child's father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man of consular rank, but he was a peripheral figure in his son's life. He died when Lucius was just a toddler, leaving the boy's upbringing entirely in the hands of his mother. Agrippina did not raise her son in the traditional Roman way, with soft lullabies and gentle bedtime stories. Her lessons were of a different, harder nature. She filled his head not with tales of mythological heroes, but with the sagas of his own ancestors, with dreams of power and destiny. She saw in him the instrument of her own ambitions, a vessel through which she could reclaim the influence and security that had been stolen from her. She nurtured his talents, ensuring he received the finest education in rhetoric, music, and the arts. But every lesson was subtly infused with the ultimate goal, the imperial throne. The child's early years were thus marked by shadows. The sun-drenched courtyards of his family's villas were always crisscrossed with the dark patterns of political intrigue. He grew up amidst a constant hum of rumors, of whispers in the gilded halls and behind closed doors. Rome was a city of secrets, a place where a careless word could lead to ruin, and where even the innocent games of a child could be interpreted through a political lens. He learned to navigate this treacherous world with a precocious awareness, to read the subtle shifts in mood and allegiance among the powerful figures who surrounded him. He saw how his mother skillfully maneuvered through the intricate web of alliances and rivalries, her every action calculated to bring her son closer to the center of power. Let your breath slow, and for a moment, step back from the grand stage of imperial politics. Imagine the world as this young boy, Lucius, would have experienced it. Picture the cobbled streets of Rome, warmed by the Mediterranean sun, the stones worn smooth by centuries of footfalls, cartwheels, and marching sandals. See the city teeming with life, a vibrant, chaotic, and endlessly fascinating metropolis. The air itself would have been thick with a symphony of smells. The sweet, earthy scent of ripe figs and the sharp, briny aroma of olives being sold in the bustling markets. The warm, comforting fragrance of freshly baked bread wafting from the open-fronted bakeries. The tang of wine from the taverns and the pervasive, slightly acrid smell of wood smoke from countless hearths. This was the sensory world that Nero, the boy who would one day be emperor, was born into. He would have heard the cacophony of the city, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of iron-rimmed wheels on stone, the babble of a dozen different languages in the crowded forum, the persuasive calls of merchants hawking their wares, and the distant, disciplined tramp of a legionary patrol. He would have seen the vibrant colors of the market stalls, piled high with produce from every corner of the empire, the stark white marble of the temples and public buildings gleaming against the deep blue sky, and the rich, ostentatious hues of the togas worn by the senatorial class. This was a world of stark contrasts, of breathtaking beauty and casual brutality. For every magnificent temple, there was a squalid, overcrowded insula, a tenement building where the city's poor lived in precarious conditions. For every eloquent speech in the Senate, there was a secret execution in a dark dungeon. For every lavish banquet, there were thousands who went hungry. This was the complex, contradictory reality of Rome. It was a city of poets and philosophers, of architects and engineers, but it was also a city of gladiators and slaves, of conspiracies and assassinations. Lucius Domitius, a Ahenobarbus, the child destined to become the Emperor Nero, was a product of this world. His character was shaped by the unique and potent combination of his mother's relentless ambition, the hothouse atmosphere of the imperial court, and the vibrant, violent, and sophisticated culture of Rome itself. He was a boy born to a great name, into a family that was both a dynasty and a den of vipers. His childhood was not one of innocence, but a long, carefully managed apprenticeship in the art of power. The seeds of the man he would become, the artist, the tyrant, the builder, the destroyer, were all sown in these formative years, in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, under the watchful, calculating gaze of his mother, Agrippina. The story of Nero is not simply the story of an individual. It is a story of the world that created him, a world of unparalleled power, beauty, and danger. The intricate dance of power in Rome, a choreography of ambition and survival, was a spectacle that Agrippina the Younger had mastered. With her son Lucius, now a young man being molded in her image, she knew that proximity to the throne was not enough. To secure his destiny, he had to be grafted onto the imperial stem itself. In a move of breathtaking audacity, a gambit that sent shockwaves through the conservative Roman aristocracy. Agrippina set her sights on the emperor himself, her own uncle, Claudius. The union was a violation of long-standing Roman custom, a marriage that bordered on incestuous, and it required a special decree from the Senate to even be considered legal. Yet, Agrippina, with her potent combination of Julio-Claudian prestige, political acumen, and undeniable charisma, navigated the treacherous waters of public opinion and senatorial procedure. She presented the marriage not as a grab for power, but as a necessary act to stabilize the imperial family, to provide the aging and often beleaguered Claudius with a capable and loyal partner. In time, her persistence paid off. Agrippina became Empress of Rome, wife to her uncle. It was a bold and calculated victory, but it was only the second act of her grand play. The final crucial step was to secure her son's position. She began to work on Claudius, her influence a constant, gentle pressure. She persuaded him, with carefully crafted arguments and subtle emotional appeals, that the future of the empire would be best served by bringing her son into the fold. She argued that adopting the boy would provide a second, younger heir to stand beside Claudius's own son, Britannicus, ensuring a smooth and secure succession. And so, with the stroke of a stylus on a wax tablet, the deed was done. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the boy with the heavy name, was formally adopted by the emperor. His name was changed, imbued now with the full weight of imperial destiny. He became Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. In that moment, he was no longer just Agrippina's son. He was Nero, heir to the Roman Empire, his claim now legally sanctioned, and his path to the throne cleared of its most significant obstacle. The imperial court, already a place of whispered conspiracies, grew quieter, more tense. The air itself seemed thick with anticipation. Then, in the autumn of 54 CE, the Emperor Claudius died. His death was officially attributed to natural causes, but few in the know believed it. The story that spread like wildfire through the corridors of the palace and the streets of Rome was a more sinister one. A tale of a final meal, a dish of mushrooms, Claudius's favorite, laced with a potent and untraceable poison. The architect of this alleged plot was, of course, rumored to be Agrippina, the ever-watchful empress who saw her moment and seized it with ruthless precision. But that is another tale, a dark thread in the imperial tapestry. What is certain is that on that day, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who served as the emperor's personal bodyguards and the ultimate arbiters of power in Rome, declared their allegiance. They marched not to the quarters of Britannicus, Claudius's natural-born son, but to Nero. At just 16 years old, a mere teenager on the cusp of manhood, Nero was hailed as imperator. Now, picture the scene. A young man, not yet 17, stands robed in imperial purple upon the steps of the palace, acclaimed by the most powerful soldiers in the world. He is thrust onto a golden throne, his feet barely touching the floor, in a vast hall of polished marble that echoes with the shuffling sandals of senators and the hushed schemes of courtiers. The weight of an empire that stretches from the Euphrates River to the Atlantic coast settles upon his slender shoulders. Across this vast domain, from the bustling ports of Alexandria to the rustic villas of Gaul, the empire holds its breath. What will become of Rome in the hands of a boy? But Nero was not alone in this monumental task. His ascension had been carefully managed, and a structure of governance was put in place to support him. Agrippina had ensured that wise and capable men would surround her son, men who could guide his hand and temper his youthful impulses. Two figures, in particular, stood as the twin pillars of the new regime. The first was Lucius Annaeus Seneca, a brilliant Stoic philosopher and one of Rome's most celebrated writers. He had been Nero's tutor, tasked with shaping his mind. Seneca's role was to teach the young emperor the virtues of wisdom, clemency, and justice, to instill in him the philosophical principles of a good ruler. The second was Sextus Afranius Burrus, a stern and respected soldier of equestrian rank, who was appointed prefect of the Praetorian Guard. Burrus was the pragmatist, the steady hand on the tiller of the state, responsible for military and administrative matters. Together, this unlikely trio, the ambitious mother, the philosophical mentor, and the loyal soldier, formed the core of the new government. For the first 5 years of Nero's reign, a period later remembered as the Quinquennium Neronis, this system worked remarkably well. Rome and the wider empire breathed a collective sigh of relief. Under the steady guidance of Seneca and Burrus, the government pursued a course of moderation and efficiency. Abuses in the tax system, which had become rampant under Claudius, were curtailed. The judicial system was reformed to ensure fairer trials, and the emperor himself often presided over cases, earning a reputation for clemency. The Senate, which had been marginalized and terrorized by previous emperors, was treated with respect, its traditional authority seemingly restored. Crowds in the city cheered for their handsome, charismatic young emperor, who seemed to embody a new era of hope and prosperity. His image, struck on coins and carved into marble, proliferated across the provinces, a symbol of a stable and well-governed world. For a time, a genuine sense of optimism floated on the Tiber River, as tangible as the morning mist. But power is a corrosive force, and hope is a fragile commodity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, that hope began to flicker. The delicate balance between Nero, his mother, and his advisors began to fray. Nero, no longer a boy, began to resent the constraints placed upon him. He was an artist at heart, passionate about music, poetry, and chariot racing pursuits considered undignified and even disgraceful for a Roman emperor. He longed to perform on stage, to be admired for his talents, not just his title. This desire clashed violently with the traditional Roman values of gravitas and duty that Seneca and Burrus tried to uphold. Furthermore, Agrippina refused to fade into the background. Having placed her son on the throne, she expected to rule through him, to be the true power behind the golden facade. Her constant interference, her possessiveness, and her public assertions of authority began to chafe at Nero's burgeoning ego. The marble halls that had once echoed with schemes to place him in power now echoed with the arguments between a willful son and a domineering mother. The first cracks in the Golden Age appeared not from external threats, but from within the palace itself. The steadying hands of Seneca and Burrus found it increasingly difficult to manage the volatile relationship between mother and son, and to restrain Nero's growing taste for extravagance and personal indulgence. The hope that had dawned so brightly over Rome began to dim, shadowed by the looming specter of a young emperor's ego, and the dark, complicated passions that were stirring in his heart. The Golden Age was not an era, but merely a moment, and it was beginning to pass. Deep within the marble heart of the Roman palace, a profound and dangerous schism was forming, not between rival factions or warring armies, but within the soul of the emperor himself. Nero, the master of the known world, harbored a secret, burning passion that was fundamentally at odds with his station. He did not love power for its own sake, nor did he possess the Roman thirst for military glory. Nero loved music. He loved the cadence and emotion of poetry, the transformative power of acting, the thrill of holding an audience captive, not with the authority of an emperor, but with the skill of an artist. While his ancestors had dreamed of vanquished armies and triumphant parades down the Via Sacra, Nero's dreams were filled with the warm glow of stage lights, the hush of an expectant crowd, and the thunderous applause that followed a perfectly delivered line or a beautifully sung verse. He dreamed not of expanding borders or balancing budgets, but of stages and encores. This artistic fervor, a private passion at first, began to seep into his public life, causing him to drift away from the solemn duties of his office. The long, tedious meetings with senators about grain shortages or provincial disputes felt like a cage, holding him from his true calling. He grew increasingly impatient with the machinery of state. Why debate legal minutiae when he could be composing a new ode to Apollo? Why listen to the counsel of old gray men when he could be rehearsing with his lyre? He began to surround himself with a different kind of court, one composed of actors, musicians, poets, and charioteers. These were the people who understood his passions, who praised his artistic talents, and who shared his vision of a world where beauty and performance were the ultimate virtues. Slowly, he began to imagine himself not as a ruler of men, a princeps who was merely the first among equals, but as a divine artist, a Hellenistic god-king destined to be adored for his sublime gifts. The role of emperor became a part he was playing, and an increasingly tiresome one at that. The wise men who had once formed a steadying bulwark around the throne found themselves on the outside of this new artistic circle. Seneca's Stoic lectures on duty, moderation, and self-control began to fall on deaf ears. His carefully reasoned arguments were no match for the intoxicating allure of the stage. Nero, who had once listened intently to his tutor, now saw him as a scolding, joyless pedant, a relic of a stuffy and unimaginative past. The true turning point, however, came with the death of Boris in 62 C. The gruff, loyal soldier who had commanded the Praetorian Guard and managed the practical affairs of the empire died suddenly, officially from an illness, though rumors of poison, as always, swirled. With Boris gone, the last true restraint on Nero's impulses was removed. He was the unshakable pillar of pragmatism, the one man Nero seemed to genuinely respect and perhaps even fear. Without him, Seneca was left isolated, his philosophical influence waning with each passing day. Nero was finally free to rule alone. Or rather, he began to rule not through logic or policy, but through emotion, through capricious whims, and increasingly, through fear. His decisions became unpredictable, driven by personal likes and dislikes, by sudden enthusiasms and dark suspicions. Those who flattered his artistic ego were promoted, while those who dared to show disapproval, even through a subtle glance, were marked as enemies. A palpable sense of dread began to creep through the Roman elite. The stability of the quinquennium felt like a distant memory. The government was no longer a predictable institution. It was an extension of the emperor's volatile personality. And fear, once unleashed, seeks a target. The first and most significant was his own mother, Agrippina. She who had been the guiding force of his rise, the master strategist who had placed him on the throne, was now seen as his greatest threat. She could not and would not accept a secondary role. She openly criticized his artistic obsessions, his affair with the ambitious Poppaea Sabina, and his neglect of his noble wife, Octavia. In her rebukes, Nero heard not a mother's concern, but a rival's challenge to his absolute authority. He resolved that she had to be eliminated. His first attempt was a ghoulishly theatrical plot, worthy of one of his own stage plays. He commissioned the construction of a special boat, designed so that its canopy, weighted with lead, would collapse and crush his mother while she slept. To make doubly sure, the vessel was also engineered to fall apart and sink at sea. He invited her to a cordial dinner at his villa in Baia, a resort town on the Bay of Naples, and saw her off with feigned affection, sending her back to her own villa on the rigged ship. But the plan went awry. The mechanism failed to work perfectly. The canopy fell but only wounded her, and the ship, though it broke apart, did so slowly. Agrippina, a woman of iron will and surprising resilience, managed to swim through the dark waters until she was picked up by a fishing boat. She knew instantly what had happened and who was responsible. She sent a messenger to Nero, calmly informing him that she had survived a terrible accident and was recovering. This message struck terror into Nero's heart. His failed attempt had exposed his hand. A wounded, vengeful Agrippina was more dangerous than ever. Panicked, he turned to Seneca and the new Praetorian prefect, Tigellinus, who convinced him that he had to finish what he had started. This time, there would be no theatrical contraptions. He sent soldiers, assassins under the command of a naval captain named Anicetus, the very man who had built the collapsible boat. They surrounded her villa, broke into her bedroom, and found her reclining on a couch. Facing them with unflinching courage, she is said to have bared her abdomen and cried out, "Strike here, in the wound that bore such a monster." They cut her down. Rome watched this horror unfold in stunned silence. The crime of matricide was one of the most heinous imaginable to the Roman mind, a profound violation of both divine and human law. Though the Senate was coerced into issuing a statement congratulating Nero on surviving a plot by his mother, no one was deceived. A dark line had been crossed. The path of blood, once opened, is easy to follow. Next came his wife, Octavia. She was the daughter of the deified Claudius, a woman of quiet dignity and impeccable nobility. She was loved by the people, who saw her as a symbol of tradition and stability, a living link to the Julio-Claudian past. But she was not loved by Nero. He found her plain and dull, a constant silent rebuke to his decadent lifestyle. His passion was for Poppaea, who would not be satisfied with the role of mistress. She wanted to be empress, and for that, Octavia had to be removed. First, Nero divorced her, accusing her of sterility. He then exiled her to the island of Panettiere, the same remote prison where other women of the imperial family had met their end. But even in exile, Octavia was a threat. Her popularity with the people of Rome remained immense, and there were riots in her name. The solution, as it had been with his mother, was final. He accused her of adultery and treason, charges so transparently false that even his chosen witnesses refused to corroborate them under torture. It made no difference. Soldiers were dispatched to the island. Her veins were opened in the traditional Roman manner of suicide, but her terror was so great that the blood flowed too slowly. She was finally suffocated in a steam bath. Her head was cut off and sent back to Rome as a gift for her rival, Poppaea. With the murder of his mother and his wife, the last vestiges of the old order were gone. The empire, once anchored by the steady hands of men like Boris and the traditions embodied by women like Octavia, now felt profoundly unsteady. It was adrift on the turbulent sea of its emperor's ego, tossed by his whims and battered by his fears. The foundations of the Roman world, which had seemed so solid and eternal, began to tremble. It is the year 64 CE. The Roman summer has reached its zenith, a season of oppressive heat and relentless sun. The air over the city is thick and still, shimmering above the cobblestones. In the sprawling, densely packed neighborhoods, where wooden tenements known as insulae lean precariously against one another, the heat is a physical presence, baking the timber frames until they are as dry as tinder. For weeks, no rain has fallen. The winds that blow in from the countryside are hot and dry, carrying dust and the scent of parched earth. Rome, the magnificent heart of the world, has become a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And then, on the night of July 18th, it comes. Flames. The fire begins in the southeastern part of the Circus Maximus, the colossal chariot racing stadium. In the arcades beneath the stands, where shops are crammed together selling flammable goods oils, textiles, torches aflicker becomes ablaze. Fanned by a strong wind, the fire leaps from the shops into the timber skeleton of the circus itself. It roars to life, a hungry beast devouring everything in its path. The blaze surges northward into the city proper, a rolling wave of destruction. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burns. The scene is apocalyptic. The narrow, winding streets of the older districts become tunnels of fire, incinerating everything and everyone trapped within. The insulae, packed with families, collapse into fiery ruin, their screams swallowed by the deafening roar of the inferno. Ancient temples, revered for centuries, their marble columns blackened by soot, vanish into the blaze. The temple of Jupiter Stator, founded by Romulus himself, is consumed. The house of the Vestals, home to Rome's sacred flame, is destroyed. The night sky, for 100 miles around, glows with a terrifying, pulsating light of orange and red, turning midnight into a hellish dawn. Panic grips the city. A tide of humanity floods the wider avenues, trying to escape the flames. People flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. They cry, they scream, they drag their children through the chaos. Their wails a symphony of loss. They curse the gods for abandoning them and curse the fates for bringing such ruin. The social order dissolves. In the face of the inferno, senator and slave are equals in their desperation. And above it all, the stories say Nero watches. From a private stage in his palace on the Palatine Hill, or perhaps from the tall tower of Maecenas, he looks out over his burning city, but he does not weep. He does not direct the firefighting efforts. Instead, dressed in the costume of a tragic actor, he takes up his lyre. As the capital of his empire turns to ash below, he strums the strings and sings. His chosen subject is the sack of Troy, an epic poem recounting the destruction of another great city by fire. His voice, trained for the stage, carries over the din, a lone artist performing for an audience of flames. Did it happen that way? Did the Emperor of Rome truly serenade the destruction of his own capital? The historian Tacitus, our most reliable source, treats the story with skepticism, noting it as a rumor. Other sources report that Nero was away at his villa in Antium when the fire broke out, and that he rushed back to the city to organize relief efforts, opening his private gardens and public buildings to house the homeless and bringing in food from surrounding towns. But in the court of public opinion, truth is often less powerful than a compelling story. The rumor of Nero fiddling while Rome burned spread like the fire itself, whispered in the refugee camps and shouted in the blackened streets. To a populace that had already witnessed his vanity and cruelty, the story was all too believable. They began to suspect something far worse, that Nero had not merely enjoyed the fire, but that he had started it himself, wanting to clear space for a grandiose new palace. In the aftermath, as the smoke cleared to reveal a landscape of devastation, Nero understood the danger he was in. 2/3 of Rome lay in ruins. Hundreds of thousands were homeless and destitute. Their grief was hardening into a cold, dangerous anger, and that anger was directed at him. He needed someone to blame, a scapegoat to divert the people's fury. His gaze fell upon a small, peculiar religious group that had been quietly growing within the city's underbelly. They were secretive, stubborn in their ways, and viewed with deep suspicion by the Roman populace. They were the Christians. To the Romans, their religion was a bizarre and perverse superstition. They refused to worship the Roman gods, an act of defiant impiety that many believed could anger the heavens and bring about disasters like a great fire. They spoke of a kingdom not of this world, which sounded like treason. They were rumored to engage in secret rites involving cannibalism, a misunderstanding of the Eucharist and incest, calling each other brother and sister. They were the perfect scapegoats, unpopular, misunderstood, and powerless. Nero declared that the Christians were responsible for the fire. The arrests began immediately. What followed was not justice, but a state-sanctioned spectacle of sadism. The persecution was designed for maximum public horror. Some Christians were crucified. Others were dressed in animal skins and thrown into the arena to be torn apart by wild dogs for the entertainment of the masses. The most grotesque punishment, however, was reserved for Nero's own garden parties. Christians were tied to stakes, coated in pitch, and set ablaze, serving as living torches to illuminate the emperor's evening festivities as he drove his chariot among the suffering. It was a brutal, horrific display, but it backfired. The Roman people, while distrustful of the Christians, were not monsters. They were horrified by the sheer cruelty and the disproportionate nature of the punishment. Tacitus writes that a sense of compassion arose for the victims, who, it was felt, were being destroyed not for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty. Nero had offered the people a scapegoat, but his methods were so vile that he only blackened his own reputation further. And while the ashes of Rome were still warm, and while the blood of his victims was still fresh on the sand of the arena, he began to build. On the vast swaths of land cleared by the fire, much of it expropriated from private citizens, Nero initiated the most ambitious construction project the city had ever seen. This was to be his new Rome, a city of wide streets, fire-resistant buildings, and at its heart, a new palace for himself. It would be called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not merely a palace, but a sprawling country estate in the middle of the city, with parks, lakes, vineyards, and a colossal, 120-foot-tall bronze statue of himself in the guise of the sun god Sol. To a city still reeling from trauma, this act of monumental self-indulgence was the ultimate insult. He had fiddled while Rome burned, and now he was building his personal paradise on its grave. The foundations of the Golden House were laid not just with brick and mortar, but with the resentment and hatred of his people. From the smoldering ruins of his capital, Nero did not see a tragedy. He saw a canvas. Where temples had stood for centuries, where crowded neighborhoods had teemed with life, he now envisioned a masterpiece of architecture and landscape design, a monument not to the gods or to Rome, but to himself. While the ashes were still warm and the citizens of Rome were huddled in makeshift shelters, mourning their dead and their lost homes, Nero began to build his palace. But this was to be no ordinary imperial residence. This was to be a dream forged in marble and gold, a statement of such breathtaking arrogance that it would forever define his reign. He called it the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. To comprehend the Golden House is to comprehend the boundless nature of Nero's ego. It was not a single building but a colossal complex, a sprawling country estate built in the very heart of the city, covering an estimated 300 acres of prime Roman real estate. It stretched across the slopes of 3 of the 7 hills, swallowing up the land where countless citizens had once lived. Its entrance was a grand portico, and before it stood the Colossus Neronis, a bronze statue of Nero, 120 feet tall, so immense that it rivaled the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the wonders of the ancient world. In this statue, Nero was depicted not as an emperor, but as Sol, the unconquerable sun god, his head adorned with a radiant crown, a clear and blasphemous declaration of his own divinity. Picture yourself walking through this impossible domain. You would pass through vineyards and pastures where flocks of sheep grazed peacefully, all within the city walls. You would come upon a great artificial lake, the Stagnum, so vast and shimmering that it resembled an inland sea, its shores dotted with mock villages and rustic temples. This was the view from the main villa, a structure that defied belief. The floors were paved with gleaming marble, plundered from the quarries of Egypt and Greece, arranged in intricate, colorful patterns. The walls were not merely painted, but inlaid with polished gemstones, mother-of-pearl, and delicate ivory frescoes, which gleamed and shifted in the light. The ceilings were not flat surfaces but vaulted masterpieces, covered in sheets of pure gold, from which the palace derived its name. The true marvels, however, lay in the engineering, which seemed to border on magic. The main dining room, the Coronatio Rotunda, was built upon a revolutionary mechanism. The great dome ceiling was designed to rotate day and night, in time with the heavens, a moving map of the constellations painted upon its surface. As guests dined on exotic delicacies, panels in the ceiling would slide open, showering them with fresh flowers and spraying mists of expensive perfume into the air. The palace had its own plumbing system, with pipes that could deliver either fresh or salt water to the lavish baths. It was a self-contained world of luxury, a paradise on earth built for a man who now saw himself as a god. This stunning creation came at a staggering cost, both financial and political. To fund the construction, the imperial treasury was drained dry. Nero resorted to desperate measures, devaluing the currency by reducing the silver content of the denarius, an act that triggered inflation and economic instability. He levied crushing taxes on the provinces, seizing the wealth of temples and forcing rich aristocrats to bequeath their fortunes to him upon their deaths. The people of Rome, struggling to rebuild their own lives, watched in simmering fury as this monument to vanity rose from the ashes of their homes. They whispered in the streets that Nero had burned the city for this very purpose. He had rebuilt Rome not for its people, but for himself. Sacred temples were moved or simply not rebuilt to make way for his gardens. Public spaces were privatized. The city was being remade as Nero's personal backdrop. As the Golden House neared completion, Nero's behavior grew more erratic, his megalomania more pronounced. He would walk through its gilded halls in flowing, translucent silk robes, his hair arranged in elaborate curls, no longer pretending to be the first citizen of Rome, but openly styling himself as a Hellenistic deity. He would spend days in his private theater within the palace, practicing his lyre, composing poetry, and rehearsing for his next public appearance. His face, now with the divine rays of soul, was on every new coin. His statues, each one seemingly taller and more grandiose than the last, proliferated throughout the empire. He was no longer just an emperor. He was a living work of art, and he demanded the world's adoration. His performances became more frequent and, crucially, compulsory. He would take to the public stage in Rome or travel to Greece to compete in the Olympic and other pan-Hellenic games, a scandalous breach of Roman dignity. He would sing, act in tragic plays, and drive chariots, and he would force the Roman elite, the senators and equestrians, to attend. They were made to sit for hours, sometimes for entire days, forbidden to leave even for the most urgent reasons. They had to applaud wildly, their praise led by a special claque of 5,000 young men, the Augustiani, who were trained in various forms of applause, from the bricks to the tiles. To show anything less than rapturous enthusiasm was to risk a charge of treason. The Senate, the proud governing body of the Republic, was reduced to a captive audience for a tyrant's amateur dramatics. Rome grew weary. The city was exhausted by the fear, the uncertainty, and the constant, draining spectacle of its emperor's ego. The people were tired of the shortages, the heavy taxes, and the sight of their emperor behaving like a preening actor while the serious business of the empire was neglected. This weariness in the capital was mirrored by a more dangerous emotion in the provinces: restlessness. From the sun-baked plains of Spain to the forests of Gaul and the deserts of Africa, the whispers of rebellion began to rise. Governors and generals, men of action and duty, looked upon the events in Rome with a mixture of contempt and alarm. They saw an empire being bankrupted to fund a single man's fantasy. They saw the legions neglected, their pay in arrears. They saw a leader who had murdered his own mother and wife, who persecuted innocents to cover his own failures, and who had abandoned the Roman virtues of gravitas and dignitas for the grease paint of the stage. The whispers grew into conversations, the conversations into plans. In Hispania, the governor Sarius Sulpicius Galba, an old and respected senator, began to listen to the overtures of Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lucdunensis. In Africa, the commander Clodius Macer cut off the vital grain supply to Rome. The threads of conspiracy, spun from disgust and ambition, began to weave together across the continent. The Golden House was meant to be Nero's masterpiece, a palace fit for a living god, but it had become a gilded prison. Its glittering walls, built on a foundation of ash and resentment, could not protect him from the storm that was gathering on the horizon. By the spring of 68 CE, the magnificent edifice of Nero's reign, like his golden house built upon ashes, began to show deep and irreparable cracks. The whispers of rebellion that had risen from the provinces had coalesced into a roar. The first major challenge came from Gaul, where the governor Gaius Julius Vindex, a man of Gallic royal descent, openly revolted, denouncing Nero as a murderer and a disgrace. Though Vindex's provincial forces were ultimately crushed by the loyalist legions stationed on the Rhine, the fire of rebellion had been lit and could not be extinguished. The very act of a Roman governor taking up arms against the emperor broke a long-held taboo and showed the world that Nero's authority was no longer absolute. The decisive blow came not from Gaul, but from Spain. The governor there, Servius Sulpicius Galba, was a stern elderly aristocrat from an ancient and respected family. He was the antithesis of Nero, disciplined, traditional, and deeply respected by his troops. Encouraged by Vindex's defiance and aware of the deep well of resentment against the emperor, Galba made his move. He stood before his legions, declared his allegiance not to Nero, but to the Senate and people of Rome, and allowed his soldiers to proclaim him imperator. This was not a provincial skirmish. This was a direct challenge for the throne by a man with the legions and a lineage to make it credible. News of Galba's rebellion traveled swiftly along the Roman roads, and the empire began to shake. One by one, the pillars of Nero's power crumbled. The legions in Africa, under Clodius Macer, who had already cut off the grain supply, declared their support for Galba. The formidable armies on the Rhine, having defeated Vindex, now refused to take a definitive side, their loyalty wavering. Nero, isolated in his gilded palace, was paralyzed by indecision. One moment he would fly into a rage, threatening to execute the entire Senate and burn the city again. The next, he would weep, composing pathetic speeches he planned to deliver to the rebellious troops, convinced his artistic skill could win them back. He prepared for both a military campaign and a theatrical tour, his mind fracturing under the immense pressure. The key to power in Rome, however, lay not in the distant provinces, but with the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite household troops. Their prefect, Nymphidius Seminus, saw the tide turning. Ambitious and opportunistic, he secretly promised the Guard a massive donative, a cash bonus of immense proportions in Galba's name. With their loyalty bought, the final betrayal was sealed. The Senate, that body of men who had been forced to applaud Nero's terrible performances, who had lived in fear of his whims for over a decade, felt the shift in power. The terror that had held them in check evaporated, replaced by a surge of long-suppressed courage and vengeance. They convened in a secret session. With the Praetorian Guard now siding with the rebels, there was no one left to defend the emperor. The senators, emboldened by their newfound safety, unanimously passed a decree. They declared Nero a hostis publicus, an enemy of the state. It was a death sentence. By Roman law, any citizen could now kill him on sight without trial. When word of the Senate's decree reached the palace, the last vestiges of Nero's world collapsed. His guards slipped away, deserting their posts. The courtiers and friends who had flattered him and feasted in his golden house vanished, melting back into the city to save their own lives. Nero awoke in the middle of the night to find his bedchamber empty, his palace silent. The master of the world was utterly alone. In a panic, he ran through the vast, echoing corridors of the Domus Aurea, calling for his friends, for his guards, for anyone, but only his own terrified voice answered. He sent a servant to summon his most trusted gladiators. None would come. He had become a ghost in his own dream. He fled the palace in disguise, a pathetic figure with a cloak thrown over his head, accompanied by a handful of his remaining loyal freedmen. He sought refuge in the homes of his former allies, but every door was barred to him. The man who had called himself a god could not find a single person in all of Rome willing to grant him shelter. Finally, one of his freedmen, Fine, offered him his own humble villa, a few miles outside the city walls. They made their way on horseback, Nero hiding his face, and at one point, His horse shied at the smell of a nearby corpse being unceremoniously dumped, causing his cloak to fall and his identity to be revealed to a passing citizen. He reached the villa, a squalid and miserable hideout compared to the splendors he had known. He had to crawl on all fours through a thicket of reeds and mud to enter from the back, so as not to be seen. Inside, he threw himself down on a straw mattress, parched with thirst but refusing the dirty water offered to him, a final pathetic assertion of his lost status. The hours ticked by in an agony of fear and self-pity. He knew the end was near. Then came the sound he had been dreading, the thundering of hoofbeats drawing closer. A courier had arrived from the city with a copy of the Senate's decree. It was read aloud to him. He was to be arrested, taken to the forum, stripped naked, his head locked in a pillory, and flogged to death. The artist, the performer who craved only applause, was to be subjected to the ultimate public humiliation. He knew he had to take his own life. It was the only honorable way out for a Roman noble, but he could not do it. He drew a dagger, tested its point, and then put it down, weeping at his own cowardice. He paced back and forth, muttering to himself, lamenting his fate. He begged one of his companions to kill himself first, to set an example. None would. The hoofbeats were louder now, the soldiers surrounding the villa. Time had run out. Turning to his faithful secretary, Epaphroditus, he asked for help. With the soldiers about to burst through the door, Nero placed the point of the dagger to his throat. Epaphroditus guided his hand and pushed, giving him the final impetus he lacked. The blade slid home. As a Roman centurion burst into the room, Nero was gasping his last breaths. The soldier, seeing the emperor bleeding out, rushed to staunch the wound, pretending he had come to save him. But it was too late. Nero looked up at him, his eyes glazing over, and uttered his final immortal words. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. It was a line dripping with the tragedy, irony, and profound self-delusion that had defined his life. Even in his final moment, he saw himself not as a failed emperor, a tyrant, or a murderer, but as a great artist whose genius the world would now lose forever. And with that final, shuddering breath, the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors was gone. The dynasty that had begun with the divine Augustus, that had ruled Rome for a century and transformed the world, ended in a squalid villa with a coward's death and an artist's lament. The Golden House would be torn down, its lake filled in to build the Colosseum. But the void left by his death would plunge Rome into a bloody civil war, the year of the 4 emperors, proving that as terrible as his reign had been, the chaos that followed would be even worse. Nero's last breath, drawn in a squalid villa outside Rome, did not bring peace to the empire. Instead, it created a vacuum, a gaping wound in the heart of the Roman world. The death of the last Julio-Claudian emperor extinguished a dynasty that had ruled for a century, a line that, for all its flaws, had provided a semblance of continuity and legitimacy. With Nero gone, the principle of hereditary succession was shattered, and the terrible secret of the empire, as the historian Tacitus would later write, was revealed. An emperor could be made elsewhere than in Rome. The throne was now the ultimate prize in a bloody free-for-all, to be claimed by whichever general had the strongest legions and the most ruthless ambition. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The empire, which had trembled under the whims of one man, now fell into the violent convulsions of civil war. The year 69 CE would forever be known as the year of the 4 emperors. Galba, the aged governor who had initiated the rebellion, marched on Rome, but his severe discipline and miserly refusal to pay the promised donatives to the Praetorian Guard quickly made him unpopular. He was murdered in the Roman Forum after only 7 months, his head paraded on a spear. His successor, Otho, a former friend of Nero, lasted just 3 months before committing suicide after being defeated in battle by the forces of Vitellius, the commander of the Rhine legions. Vitellius, in turn, proved to be a gluttonous and ineffective ruler, his brief reign marked by excess and brutality. By the end of the year, he too was dead, dragged through the streets of Rome by the soldiers of the fourth and final claimant, Vespasian, the pragmatic and battle-hardened general who had been suppressing the Jewish revolt in Judea. The civil war had torn the empire apart, leaving tens of thousands dead and entire regions devastated. For the average Roman who had survived the fire, the persecutions, and the heavy taxes of Nero's final years, the chaos that followed his death was infinitely worse. In the midst of this turmoil, Nero's story remained, refusing to be buried with his body. His legacy fractured almost immediately into two opposing narratives, two ghosts of the same man that would haunt the Roman imagination for centuries. To the senatorial elite, the historians, and the new Flavian dynasty that sought to legitimize its rule by blackening the name of its predecessor, Nero was an unmitigated monster. He was the ultimate tyrant, a cautionary tale of power corrupting absolutely. This was the Nero who murdered his own mother and his noble wife, who callously torched his own city to build a monument to his vanity, and who scapegoated an innocent religious minority with sadistic glee. He was the preening actor who shamed the dignity of his office, the spendthrift who bankrupted the state, and the matricide who violated the most sacred laws of gods and men. This is the version of Nero that has echoed most loudly through history, a caricature of madness and cruelty, the mad emperor who destroyed everything he was meant to protect. Yet there was another story, a whisper that persisted among the common people, especially in the Greek-speaking East, where his cultural passions were understood and admired. To them, he was a tragic soul, a Philhellene emperor who loved art more than war. They remembered the first 5 years of his reign, the Quinquennium Neronis, as a golden age of stability and fair governance. They remembered his generosity, the lavish games and festivals he provided, and his genuine, if misplaced, passion for culture. In this telling, Nero was not a monster, but an artist tragically lost in the brutal role of a ruler. He was a man whose sensitive, creative spirit was unsuited to the grim realities of Roman politics, a soul forced into a destiny he never truly wanted. This was the emperor who dreamed of stages and applause, not legions and laws, and whose downfall was a tragedy of circumstance as much as character. This populist affection was not merely a feeling. It manifested in remarkable ways. For years after his death, Romans would secretly visit his tomb in the Pincian Hill Cemetery, a modest grave paid for by 2 of his childhood nurses and a former mistress. They would leave flowers, violets, and roses, a quiet, poignant tribute to the man they missed. This affection fueled an even more extraordinary phenomenon, the Nero Redivivus legend. A powerful rumor spread like wildfire, insisting that Nero had not truly died. He had escaped his assassins, fled to the east, and was hiding among the Parthians, Rome's great rival. Soon, the legend promised, he would return at the head of a mighty army to reclaim his crown and punish his enemies. This belief was so potent that for 2 decades after his death, several impostors, pseudo-Neros, appeared in the east. Each one bore a resemblance to the late emperor, could play the lyre and sing, and managed to gather a significant following before being captured and executed by Roman authorities. The persistence of this myth reveals the profound impact Nero had on the popular imagination. To his detractors, he was the Antichrist. To his admirers, he was a lost king, a messianic figure whose return they eagerly awaited. But in Rome, the city he had both loved and terrorized, the official verdict was absolute. The new Flavian dynasty systematically dismantled his legacy. His memory was condemned, his name chiseled off inscriptions. His colossal statue was altered, its features recrafted to represent the sun god Sol, stripping it of Nero's identity. And his most audacious creation, the Domus Aurea, was buried. Its opulent rooms were filled with earth, its structures used as foundations for new buildings. Upon the site of its great artificial lake, Vespasian began construction of a new amphitheater, a gift to the Roman people, built for their entertainment on the very land Nero had seized for his private pleasure. It would become known as the Colosseum, its name a lasting, ironic echo of the nearby Colossus of Nero. The golden house crumbled. The statues fell. The whispers of his return eventually faded into folklore. The city, resilient and eternal, moved on, building new monuments over the old, writing new histories over the ones that had been erased. Yet, the story of Nero, the last of the Caesars, endures, as complex and contradictory as the man himself. Was he a monster or a martyr to his own artistic soul? A madman or a misunderstood visionary? The truth, perhaps, is that he was all of these things. He remains a vibrant, unsettling ghost in the corridors of history, a testament to the seductive and destructive power of absolute authority, and a timeless reminder of what can happen when the man on the throne is playing a role for which he is tragically, catastrophically miscast. And now, with our journey through the fire and fervor of his life complete, we must do what his contemporaries could not do for decades. We leave Nero behind. The curtain falls on the grand tragic opera of his reign. The final desperate notes of his lyre have faded, the last echoes of applause have died, and the thunder of rebellious legions has fallen silent. We step away from the blood and the gold, the triumphs and the terrors, and let the man, in all his complexity, recede into the annals of history where he belongs. Let us walk once more through the streets of ancient Rome, but not the city of Nero's time, teeming with life and fear. Let us walk instead through a city of memory, quiet and bathed in the soft, forgiving light of the moon. The air is cool now, carrying not the scent of smoke or perfume, but the clean, earthy smell of night-blooming jasmine and damp stone. Our footsteps make no sound on the great dark paving slabs of the Via Sacra. We are ghosts in a city of ghosts. We pass the place where the Golden House once stood, that impossible dream of a palace. There is no gleam of jewels here now, no rotating ceiling revealing painted stars. In the hollow of the valley, where Nero's vast artificial lake once shimmered, the ground is marshy and dark. We can almost feel the immense weight of the future pressing down on this spot, the spectral outline of an amphitheater that is still centuries from being built. The Colosseum, a monument that will rise from the ashes of a tyrant's vanity, forever named for the colossal statue he built in his own image. This land is a testament to how Rome consumes and rebuilds, burying the dreams of one emperor to create the stage for the entertainment of 1 million citizens. We drift onward, toward the Forum. Here, under the stark columns of ruined temples, the air is thick with unspoken words. This is where the senators once whispered of his fall, their voices hushed with terror and ambition. We can imagine their shades still lingering, cloaked in shadow, their faces pale with the memory of forced applause and the grim satisfaction of their final, vengeful decree. They are frozen in an eternal debate, forever weighing the cost of freedom against the price of survival. The Curia is silent, the rostra empty. The heart of the Republic, which still beat faintly even under the emperors, is quiet now, holding the secrets of a dozen generations. The fire is out. That great conflagration, both literal and metaphorical, which consumed Rome and Nero's reign, has long since burned itself to embers. The frantic crowds have gone, their cries of agony and anger dispersed into the winds of time. The homeless have found new homes, the dead have been buried, and the city, scarred but resilient, has healed. And after all the chaos, after the civil war and the rise and fall of other emperors, all that remains of the man himself is memory, a fractured, contested, and powerful legacy. It is a story told in the biased histories of his enemies, in the hushed folklore of those who loved him, and in the enduring architecture that rose to replace what he had built. As we stand here now, in the quiet heart of this sleeping city, you may think of Nero not just as the simple villain of a history play. The story, when held to the light, reveals more complex and troubling shades. See him, perhaps, as a timeless reminder of truths we still grapple with today. He is a lesson in the crushing weight of power, a demonstration of how absolute authority, placed in the hands of one who is unprepared and unworthy, can become a poison that corrupts the soul not with malice alone, but with whim, insecurity, and a desperate, insatiable need to be loved. He is a warning about the danger of pride, of a hubris so profound that it seeks to remake the world in its own image. Nero's greatest sin was not merely his cruelty, but his belief that he could treat an empire as his personal stage, its people as his captive audience, and its future as a script he alone could write. He sought to be the artist of his own divinity, and in doing so, he forgot the simple, fragile humanity of those he ruled. And perhaps most poignantly, he is a symbol of the profound loneliness that comes when the applause fades. His entire life was a performance, a frantic search for adoration. Yet, in his final hours, when he ran terrified through the empty halls of his golden house, he found only silence. The friends had vanished, the sycophants had fled, and the adoring crowds were calling for his death. The silence he faced in that dark villa was the true and terrible antithesis of the life he had tried to live. It is in that final, pathetic plea for a servant to help him die that we see not a god or a monster, but a terrified man, utterly and completely alone, facing the consequences of a life lived for an audience that had long since gone home. Let the night take you now. Let the coolness of the Roman air soothe you. Our journey is over, and it is time for rest. Let Nero's story, with all its sound and fury, finally settle. Let it become like a fine layer of dust on an old marble floor, a part of the vast, silent landscape of the past, visible but no longer disturbing. It is a story that belongs to the night, to the realm of memory and reflection. And so, we leave Nero behind. The torches have burned low. The golden halls echo with silence. The emperor is gone. Rome, ever enduring, moves forward. But if you thought Nero's reign was strange, wait until you meet the emperor who came before him, the one who danced with madness in broad daylight, who rode the tides of cruelty and whimsy like a child splashing in a fountain. Before Nero sang to a burning city, there was Caligula, born into tragedy, raised in the shadow of power, and crowned far too young. His story is one of brilliance lost to delusion, kindness twisted by suffering. He began his rule beloved, and ended it with swords in the dark. So now, if you're still with me, eyes growing heavier, thoughts slowing, let's drift a little further back in time, to the year 37 CE. Rome is still grieving the death of Emperor Tiberius. The Senate is nervous, the people are restless, and the new emperor is just 24 years old. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but history remembers him by another name, Caligula. Let's step quietly into his world. The year is 37 C. The air in Rome, a city that is the heart of the known world, is thick with a palpable and anxious uncertainty. For over 2 decades, the empire has been held in the cold, unloving grip of its second emperor, Tiberius. His reign, which began with promise, had curdled into a long winter of paranoia and fear. The old emperor has just died, not in the bustling capital, but in a distant coastal villa, as remote and isolated as his own spirit. He had ruled not from the Palatine Hill, but from the island fortress of Capri, a recluse hiding behind cliffs and whispers. His presence in Rome felt only through the chilling edicts that emanated from his retreat and the ever-present threat of his ruthless Praetorian prefect, Sejanus. Under Tiberius, Rome had become a city of shadows. The laws of treason, or maestas, had been twisted into a weapon, used to eliminate political rivals and silence even the mildest dissent. A careless word at a dinner party, a joke told to the wrong person, could lead to accusation, ruin, and a quiet death sentence. The Senate, once a body of proud and powerful men, had been cowed into submission, its members living in constant fear of spies and informers. The people of Rome rarely saw their emperor. He was a phantom, a source of dread rather than a figure of reverence. His death is met not with widespread grief, but with a collective citywide sigh of relief, a cautious exhalation of breath held for far too long. And now, into this vacuum of fear and suspicion, a new emperor rises. He is everything Tiberius was not. He is young, only 24 years old, with the vigor and energy of youth. He is handsome, with the noble features of his famed Julio-Claudian lineage. And he is charismatic, possessing an easy charm that captivates all who meet him. His name is Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, a name that carries the weight of divinity and conquest, the legacy of both the great Julius Caesar and the deified Augustus. But the people of Rome, in their surge of affection, do not call him Gaius. They call him by a name that is both familiar and endearing, a name that evokes not the cold marble halls of power, but the rugged, loyal heart of the Roman army. They call him Caligula. The name means little boots, and it is a relic of a golden childhood, a nickname born from love and laughter on the empire's harsh northern frontier. His father was Germanicus, one of the most beloved figures in Roman history, a brilliant general, a man of honor, and the adopted son of Tiberius. Germanicus commanded the legions on the Rhine, and he kept his family with him in the military camps. His young son Gaius became the mascot of the army. The hardened, battle-scarred legionaries, men who faced death daily, were utterly charmed by the toddler who lived among them. They fashioned for him a perfect miniature soldier's uniform, complete with a tiny breastplate and a toy sword. And on his small feet, they fitted child-sized military sandals or caligae. Picture the scene: a small boy, barely old enough to walk steadily, marching proudly alongside towering centurions, his little boots kicking up the dust of the camp, his face beaming with delight. The soldiers adored him. They would hoist him onto their shoulders, cheer his clumsy attempts to imitate their drills, and roar with affectionate laughter. It was they who gave him the name he would carry for the rest of his life, Caligula. It was a name steeped in the loyalty of the legions and the memory of his heroic father. When the people of Rome now shouted this name, they were not just cheering for a new emperor. They were cheering for the return of the spirit of Germanicus, for a connection to a past filled with glory and hope. To a Rome starved of joy, Caligula seems like a gift from the gods, a golden prince sent to usher in a new era. His bloodline is impeccable, a perfect confluence of the empire's most revered figures. He is the son of the war hero Germanicus. Through his mother, Agrippina the Elder, he is the great-grandson of the divine Augustus, the architect of the Roman Empire. The people see in his handsome face the promise of a glorious future and a definitive break from the gloomy past. For the first few months, the empire rejoices. Caligula's every action seems calculated to confirm their wildest hopes. He delivers a moving eulogy for Tiberius, publicly weeping for the man the rest of Rome despised. A masterful act of political theater that demonstrated his piety and respect for tradition. Then, he sets about dismantling the machinery of his predecessor's tyranny. The temples, many of which had fallen into neglect, are reopened and their rituals restored with lavish ceremony. The city is once again filled with the sights and sounds of public worship, the scent of incense, and the spectacle of grand sacrifices. This return to religious observance feels like a spiritual cleansing of the city after years of darkness. He stages magnificent games for the people, far grander than anything seen in years. The Circus Maximus thunders with the sound of chariot races, while gladiators clash in the arena, their contests thrilling the vast crowds. These spectacles are not just entertainment, they are a powerful statement. Caligula is showing his generosity, sharing his good fortune with his people. and restoring a sense of joy and community to the city. In his most celebrated act, he orders the release of all those held on treason charges under Tiberius. Prisoners who had languished in dungeons for years, expecting to die in obscurity, are freed. He burns the records of their trials in the Forum, declaring an end to the era of spies and secret accusations. This single act of clemency earns him the undying adoration of the senatorial class and the public alike. It is a symbolic bonfire of the past, a promise of a future free from fear. He eases the burden of taxation, abolishing certain unpopular levies and using his own vast inheritance to pay the generous bequests left in Tiberius's will, which the old emperor had failed to honor. This economic relief further cements his popularity among merchants and commoners. The people cheer his name in the streets, hailing him as a star and a savior. Statues are erected in his honor, and the Senate vies to bestow upon him ever more prestigious titles. It seems just for a brief, shining moment that the long night is over. The sun has risen over the 7 hills, and Rome, at last, has found its golden prince. The joyous celebrations that greeted Caligula's ascension, the cheers for the golden prince, were a testament to the power of public hope and the allure of a flawless pedigree. But this glittering facade concealed a past riddled with trauma, a childhood not of gold, but of blood and shadow. To understand the Emperor Caligula would become, one must first understand the crucible that forged the boy Gaius. His life, even before the throne, was shaped by an almost unimaginable degree of pain and fear. It began when he was just a boy of 7, living in the exotic and politically charged province of Syria. His father, Germanicus, the hero of the northern frontiers, had been sent to the east on a mission of great importance. But his time there was marked by a bitter and public feud with the governor of Syria, Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso, a man widely seen as a loyal agent of Emperor Tiberius. Suddenly, Germanicus fell ill. It was a strange, wasting sickness that baffled his physicians. As he lay dying, convinced he was the victim of foul play, his chambers were searched. Hidden under the floorboards and behind the walls, his men found gruesome evidence of what they believed to be black magic. Curse tablets inscribed with his name, remnants of human bones, and other sinister paraphernalia. Germanicus died in the arms of his wife, Agrippina, whispering that he had been poisoned. The news of his death struck the empire like a physical blow. When Agrippina the Elder returned to Italy, her ship docking at Brundisium, the scene was one of profound national grief. She walked down the gangplank in mourning black, clutching the funeral urn that contained her husband's ashes, her face a mask of defiant sorrow. The crowds that lined the port and the roads to Rome wept openly. But Agrippina's grief was mingled with a cold, burning rage. She was convinced that Pisa had murdered her husband on the direct orders of the emperor himself. She accused Tiberius, not in hushed whispers, but with the public and reckless fury of a woman who felt she had nothing left to lose. It was a dangerous, fatal miscalculation. Tiberius was not a man to be challenged. He allowed Piso to stand trial, but the proceedings were a sham, and before a verdict could be reached, Piso was found dead in his home, officially a suicide, though many believed he had been silenced to prevent him from implicating the emperor. With Piso gone, Tiberius's cold, methodical vengeance turned toward the family of Germanicus. He saw in their immense popularity a threat to his own power, and in Agrippina's accusations an unforgivable act of treason. One by one, Caligula's world was dismantled. He watched as his mother, the proudest woman in Rome, was declared an enemy of the state. She was arrested and exiled to the barren prison island of Pandateria, the same island where Augustus had banished his own daughter. There, she was starved, beaten so severely that she lost an eye, and ultimately driven to take her own life. Caligula's older brother, Nero Caesar, once hailed as the heir apparent, was similarly arrested, exiled, and forced into suicide. His next brother, Drusus Caesar, was imprisoned in the dungeons beneath the imperial palace in Rome, chained and starved to death with such deliberate cruelty that he was said to have chewed the stuffing from his mattress in his final, agonizing days. Cousins, friends, and supporters of the family were systematically rounded up, tried on trumped-up charges, and executed. The great house of Germanicus was being methodically annihilated. Only Gaius remained. He was too young, perhaps, to be seen as an immediate threat. He was the last surviving son, a living relic of a family that had been all but erased. And then came the summons. He was to leave the care of his grandmother and be brought to the island of Capri, to live with the very man who had destroyed his family, the Emperor Tiberius. Imagine the terror of that journey for the young man. He was being delivered into the hands of his personal boogeyman, the shadowy figure responsible for the death of his mother and brothers. Capri was not a home. It was a gilded cage, a place of legend known for its debauchery, but more accurately, a nest of vipers ruled by a paranoid and cruel old man. For 6 long years, from the age of 19 to 25, Caligula lived under the cold, watchful gaze of Emperor Tiberius. He was a prisoner surrounded by luxury, a hostage at the emperor's table. To survive in that environment required an almost superhuman act of self-effacement. He learned to bury his grief, to mask his hatred, and to erase any trace of his true personality. He understood that any flicker of resentment, any echo of his mother's defiance, would mean his immediate death. He became a master of deception, a student in the art of the mask. He learned to smile when he wanted to scream, to offer praise when he felt only contempt, and to say nothing when his mind was reeling with thoughts of revenge. The historian Suetonius described him as the perfect actor, a young man who studiously ignored the daily torments and humiliations inflicted upon him, pretending that nothing was amiss. He was a snake in a garden, still, quiet, watching. He observed Tiberius's methods, the use of fear as a tool of governance, the arbitrary nature of absolute power, the way paranoia could twist a man into a monster. He saw how the most powerful men in Rome would tremble and grovel before the emperor, and he learned the intoxicating language of tyranny. Every day on Capri was a lesson in how to be an emperor in the darkest Roman tradition. He was not merely surviving, he was learning. He was absorbing the poison of the place, allowing it to fill the void left by the loss of his family. And so, when Tiberius finally died on the nearby mainland, or perhaps was smothered by a pillow on his deathbed by the Praetorian prefect Macro, as some whispers later claimed, possibly at Caligula's own instigation, the performance was over. The snake had shed its skin. Caligula stepped forward, his face a carefully constructed mask of solemn grief for the man he despised. The years of silent rage, of forced smiles and buried trauma had forged him into something new. The frightened boy was gone, replaced by a 24-year-old man who had mastered the art of survival through absolute deception. He was now the sole heir, the last of his line, and he became emperor not just by birthright, but by virtue of being the last one standing after a brutal family war. The crowds cheered for the Golden Prince, the son of Germanicus, but the man who took the throne was the creation of Tiberius, a graduate of the School of Fear, ready to unleash the lessons he had learned so well. In the first sun-drenched months of his rule, Caligula governed with a grace and piety that seemed to answer the fervent prayers of an entire empire. His every public act was a carefully choreographed repudiation of the dark, reclusive reign of Tiberius. He began by healing the deep wounds within his own family, wounds that mirrored the suffering of many Roman elites. He sailed personally into the tempestuous winter seas to the prison islands of Pandateria and Pontia. There, with great ceremony, he gathered the ashes of his mother, Agrippina, and his brother, Nero Caesar remains that had been left neglected in unmarked graves. He brought them back to Rome, not in secret, but in a grand procession. As he carried the urns into the city, the people wept with him, seeing not just an emperor performing a rite, but a devoted son honoring his wronged family. He had their ashes interred with the highest honors in the mausoleum of Augustus, a symbolic act that restored their dignity and publicly condemned the injustice they had suffered. He understood that power in Rome rested on the twin pillars of popular support and military loyalty. For the people, he continued to host lavish games and spectacles. For the soldiers, he was equally generous. He immediately paid out the bequest left to the Praetorian Guard in Tiberius's will, and then, from his own vast fortune, added a substantial bonus, doubling the amount. This act secured the fierce loyalty of the elite soldiers who controlled the capital. He was their little boots once more, the son of Germanicus who understood and respected the military. Unlike the phantom emperor Tiberius, Caligula was a constant, visible presence. He gave eloquent speeches in the Senate, promising to rule in partnership with them. He appeared in public, walking among the people, his handsome face and easy charm a source of constant delight. He was accessible, vibrant, and seemed to embody all the promise of his youth and noble heritage. For a while, the city was swept up in a tide of genuine adoration. The relief of being free from Tiberius's reign of terror was so immense that the people projected all their hopes and dreams onto their new leader. They showered him with affection, bestowing upon him a series of loving, almost paternal nicknames. They called him "our baby," a term of endearment for the young man they felt they had watched grow up. They called him "our star," a celestial guide leading them out of darkness. They called him "our Caesar," bestowing upon him the ultimate name of power, not as a formal title, but as a heartfelt acclamation. For a brief, shining moment, the bond between the emperor and his people was one of pure, unadulterated love. Rome was giddy with optimism, but the brightness was not destined to last. The foundations of this golden age were built on the fragile ground of one man's mind, a mind that had been scarred by years of trauma and was now buckling under the immense pressure of absolute power. In the autumn of 37 CE, just 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell gravely ill. The nature of the sickness is lost to history, recorded only as a brain fever or a severe nervous collapse. A burning fever took hold of him, leaving him delirious and weak. His mind, once so sharp and charming, began to waver. He was near death, his life hanging by a thread. The news of his illness plunged Rome into a state of panic. The joy that had filled the streets turned to collective, desperate fear. The Golden Prince, their savior, was being stolen from them. The city became a massive, open-air temple. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, keeping a silent, anxious vigil day and night. The temples were thronged with people offering sacrifices, making vows, and praying to the gods for his recovery. Some citizens, in a display of ultimate devotion, publicly offered to give their own lives in exchange for his. Others swore to become gladiators and fight to the death in his honor if only he would be spared. The empire held its breath. The prospect of his death meant not just the loss of a beloved leader, but a terrifying return to uncertainty. Who would succeed him? Would the dark days of treason trials return? Or, worse, would the empire descend into a bloody civil war as rival claimants vied for the empty throne? The entire Roman world, it seemed, was clinging to the faint, flickering pulse of the young man on the sickbed. And then, slowly, miraculously, he recovered. The fever broke. His strength returned. The news was met with an explosion of ecstatic relief. The city erupted in celebration, the festivals even more joyous than those that had marked his ascension. Their prayers had been answered. Their emperor was restored to them. But something had changed. Something had broken in the crucible of that illness. The man who returned from that sickbed was not the same one who had entered it. The transformation was not immediate, but a gradual, terrifying unveiling. The easy grace was gone, replaced by an unsettling arrogance. The charming smile now seemed to hide a sneer. His eyes, once warm and engaging, now held a disturbing, manic light. The fever had passed, but it seemed to have burned away the delicate mask of sanity he had worn for so long. The mask he had so carefully constructed during his years on Capri. The trauma of his childhood, the paranoia he had absorbed from Tiberius, the immense psychological weight of his deification by the masses, and the brush with death seemed to have conspired to shatter his mind. The man who emerged was no longer bound by the normal conventions of human behavior. He was impatient, erratic, and possessed of a chilling new belief in his own absolute power and divinity. The illness had been a turning point, a dark baptism from which he emerged reborn, not as a golden prince, but as something else entirely. The city had prayed for his recovery, and the gods, in their cruel irony, had answered them by giving them back a monster. The man who emerged from the fever-haunted sickbed was a terrifying stranger in the body of an emperor. The delicate psychological balance that had allowed him to survive his traumatic youth and perform the role of a benevolent ruler had been shattered. In its place was a bottomless well of paranoia, grandiosity, and a terrifying, whimsical cruelty. Caligula's behavior, once charmingly eccentric, now grew profoundly strange, veering into a realm of madness that left Rome bewildered and terrified. He began to see himself not as a mere representative of the gods, but as their equal, and soon, their superior. The traditional, stately role of the Roman princeps was no longer enough for him. He began to dress in elaborate costumes, shedding his imperial toga for the divine attributes of the Olympian pantheon. One day, he would appear in public dressed as Jupiter Capitolinus, wielding a gilded trident and a crown of lightning bolts, his face powdered to an otherworldly sheen. The next, he might be seen in the lion skin and club of Hercules, or even as the goddess Venus, draped in translucent silks and adorned with pearls. He was not merely playing a part. In his fractured mind, he was inhabiting these deities, demanding the reverence due to them. This was not a matter of poetic metaphor or private fantasy. Caligula sought to make his divinity a matter of law and public policy. He declared himself a living god, a deus praesens. He established a temple to his own godhead, complete with a college of priests, a role he forced upon the wealthiest and most distinguished senators, who had to pay exorbitant sums for the humiliating privilege of serving him. Inside this temple stood a life-size golden statue of Caligula, which was dressed each day in an exact replica of the clothes the emperor himself was wearing. Senators, men who traced their lineage back to the founding of the Republic, were now made to prostrate themselves and worship the image of the man who ruled them. Ordinary citizens were forced to address him with divine titles. To refuse was treason. His divine conversations were a source of public spectacle and private terror. He would be seen in the open forum at night, his face turned to the sky, seemingly engaged in a long and intimate conversation with the full moon, whom he called his lover. He would stand for hours before the statue of Jupiter in the temple, whispering conspiratorially into its marble ear one moment, then shouting at it in a jealous rage the next. He ordered a bridge of boats to be built across the Bay of Baia, a monumental feat of engineering with no practical purpose, simply so he could ride across it on horseback, wearing the breastplate of Alexander the Great, to demonstrate his mastery over the sea god Neptune. He was a man conversing with a universe that existed only in his mind, and he was dragging the entire Roman Empire into his delusion. His spending soon matched the boundlessness of his ego. The vast fortune left by Tiberius, which had seemed inexhaustible, was squandered in a matter of months. He staged gladiatorial games of unprecedented scale and cost. He built 2 massive aqueducts and renovated the port of Rhegium. He laid the foundations for a new amphitheater. His most extravagant projects were his personal palaces, which he decorated with a reckless opulence that defied belief. He had dining rooms with ceilings inlaid with pearls and precious stones. He built stables for his favorite horse, Incitatus, out of marble, with a manger of ivory, and would even invite the horse to dine with him at state banquets, serving it wine from a golden goblet. And when the money ran out, as it inevitably did, his methods for replenishing the treasury became a new form of tyranny. He revived the treason trials he had so righteously abolished, but this time, they were not about political threats. They were a fundraising tool. He would accuse wealthy nobles of fictitious crimes, execute them, and confiscate their entire estates. He forced prominent citizens to name him as the sole heir in their wills, and then, growing impatient, would send a suggestion that they take their own lives to speed up his inheritance. He opened a brothel in the imperial palace itself, staffed by the wives and daughters of senators, with the profits going directly to the imperial coffers. He seized the sacred offerings from temples across the empire. No source of wealth was safe from his rapacious grasp. Caligula's cruelty soon grew to match his extravagance, and it was a cruelty that was personal, intimate, and theatrical. He found that he delighted in fear, that the terror in a man's eyes gave him a thrill that even his divine fantasies could not match. He did not kill for political necessity. He killed for sport, for whim, for the sheer pleasure of demonstrating his absolute power over life and death. He had men executed for the most minor offenses, for a poorly worded compliment, for appearing in public wearing the wrong color, or for no reason at all. He enjoyed watching pain, often insisting that executions be carried out with small, repeated blows to prolong the victim's suffering, instructing the executioner to strike so that he feels he is dying. His court became a place of psychological torture. He would invite senators to a lavish dinner, treat them with convivial charm, and then, hours later, as they returned home, have them arrested and executed. He would force fathers to watch the torture and execution of their own sons, and then expect them to return to the banquet and make witty conversation. He would whisper a death sentence into a man's ear while kissing him on the cheek. He understood that the uncertainty was the most potent weapon of all. No one knew when the axe would fall, and this constant, gnawing fear was more effective at controlling the elite than any army. He summarized this terrifying philosophy of rule himself. When his advisors cautioned him that his actions were making him hated by the people and the Senate, he is said to have sneered back at them with the words that would define his reign. It was a phrase that stripped away all pretense of benevolence, all notions of the emperor as the father of his people. It was the pure, unvarnished creed of a tyrant. Oderant dum medoan. Let them hate me, so long as they fear me. In that single chilling statement, the Golden Prince was well and truly dead. In his place stood a monster god, a ruler who drew his power not from love or respect, but from the terror he inspired, a man who found his ultimate satisfaction in the hatred of his people. Of all the tales of madness and excess that cling to the memory of Caligula like a funeral shroud, one story stands above the rest, shimmering with a unique blend of the absurd and the terrifying. It is a story that has galloped through 2 millennia of history, becoming the ultimate symbol of his reign, a perfect encapsulation of his contempt for tradition and his terrifying detachment from reality. It is the story of his horse. He was a magnificent creature, a beautiful white stallion of Spanish descent named Incitatus, which translates to at full gallop or swift. In a world where Caligula trusted no one, where every human relationship was tainted by fear and suspicion, his affection for this horse was perhaps the only pure and genuine emotion he possessed. He loved Incitatus dearly, with a devotion that bordered on worship. The horse was not merely an animal. He was a confidant, a symbol of strength and beauty, and a silent, non-judgmental companion in a world of whispering sycophants and plotting senators. This affection manifested in a level of luxury that would have been the envy of most Roman nobles. Caligula commissioned a stable for Incitatus, built not of wood and straw, but of polished marble. The horse's manger, from which he ate his oats mixed with flakes of gold, was carved from a single block of ivory. His drinking trough was pristine, his water always fresh. He wore not a simple leather bridle, but a collar encrusted with a dazzling array of precious jewels and pearls. He was covered in purple blankets, the color of royalty, the most expensive dye in the ancient world. But the emperor's devotion did not stop at mere material comfort. Incitatus was given a house, complete with a full retinue of servants and slaves dedicated solely to his care and comfort. These servants were tasked with ensuring the horse was never disturbed. On the nights before Incitatus was scheduled to race in the Circus Maximus, Caligula would impose a city-wide silence, enforced by his soldiers, to ensure his champion's sleep was not disturbed by any noise. To entertain guests in the horse's name was considered a high honor. Dignitaries and senators would receive formal invitations, engraved on fine tablets, to dine with Incitatus in his lavish home. At these bizarre banquets, the horse would be the guest of honor, while the most powerful men in Rome made polite conversation and toasted his health. This, in itself, was strange enough, a sign of a deeply eccentric and indulgent ruler. But Caligula, in his escalating madness, pushed the boundaries of absurdity into the realm of the sacred and the political. In a move that left the city utterly dumbfounded, he declared Incitatus a priest. The horse was officially inducted into a newly created priestly college, alongside some of the most distinguished and high-ranking men in Rome. These senators, who could trace their ancestry back for centuries, were now colleagues with a horse in the service of a new cult. And then came the final, breathtaking rumor, the story that would cement his legend forever. Caligula, it was said, announced his intention to elevate Incitatus to the highest and most sacred political office in the Roman state. He planned to make his horse a consul. The consulship was the pinnacle of a Roman aristocrat's career, an office once held by giants like Cicero, Pompey, and Julius Caesar himself. It was the symbolic heart of the old republic, a position of immense power and prestige. The idea of a horse holding this office was not just an insult. It was a declaration that the entire Roman political system was a meaningless farce. Why? For 2,000 years, historians have debated this question, trying to find the line between calculated political satire and pure, unadulterated insanity. What was the motive behind this ultimate act of imperial absurdity? One interpretation sees it as a deliberate and savage piece of political theater, a calculated mockery of the Senate. In this view, Caligula was not truly mad, but was instead a deeply intelligent and cynical ruler who despised the hypocrisy of the aristocracy. He saw the senators as fawning, corrupt, and powerless men who would agree to anything, no matter how humiliating, to preserve their wealth and status. By proposing his horse for the consulship, he was holding up a mirror to them saying, "You are so servile and worthless that my horse is more fit to govern than any of you. He's more noble, more honest, and his counsel is just as valuable as yours." It was a gesture of supreme contempt, designed to expose their impotence and to demonstrate that their cherished traditions and offices were now entirely dependent on his whim. Another, darker interpretation suggests that there was no satire involved, that this was simply the logical endpoint of his spiraling madness. This view holds that Caligula, in his profound isolation and paranoia, had lost all connection to reality. His belief in his own divinity was absolute. As a god, he was above all human laws and traditions. The rules that governed mortal men were irrelevant to him. If he, a god, loved this horse, then the horse too must possess a divine quality. Appointing him a priest and a consul was not a joke. It was a sincere expression of his divine will. In the fractured universe of Caligula's mind, where he conversed with the moon and argued with statues, making his horse a consul was a perfectly rational act. It was the world that was insane for not understanding. Even now, historians debate the line. Was he a brilliant satirist, a proto-performance artist using absurdity to critique a corrupt system? Or was he a deeply disturbed man, a victim of his own trauma and absolute power, lost in a world of his own making? Perhaps the most terrifying answer is that he was both. It is possible that the act began as a cynical joke, a way to mock his enemies, but was then embraced by his own burgeoning madness until he came to believe it himself. The line between the performance and the reality blurred until it ceased to exist. Whatever the reason, the story remains more powerful and enduring than any of his temples or palaces. It has outlived the Roman Empire itself. The image of Incitatus, the horse consul, has become a timeless shorthand for tyranny at its most bizarre and irrational. It is the story that people tell when they want to describe a ruler who's not just cruel, but has become completely untethered from the world his people inhabit. It is the ultimate proof that for Caligula, the Roman Empire, its laws, its gods, its people, and its sacred traditions had become nothing more than a plaything, a stage for the lonely, terrifying drama unfolding in his own mind. As the months bled into years, the fever of Caligula's madness consumed not only his own mind, but the very soul of Rome. The city, once a place of law and tradition, became a stage for the whims of a single, unpredictable actor. And as his power grew more absolute, his divinity more pronounced, Caligula became the most isolated man in the world. He had declared himself a god, but he lived with the gnawing paranoia of a cornered animal. He trusted no one. The same suspicious dread that had haunted Tiberius on Capri now took root in Caligula's own heart, but it blossomed into something far more venomous and active. He saw conspiracies in every shadow, treason in every sideways glance. To protect himself from these imagined threats, he spun a vast web of espionage that enveloped the city. He unleashed a plague of informers or delators, rewarding them handsomely for any scrap of information, no matter how flimsy, that could be used against a wealthy senator or a perceived rival. These spies infiltrated every corner of Roman life. They were in the homes of the nobility, disguised as servants, listening to dinner conversations. They were in the temples, noting who failed to offer a prayer to the emperor's divine genius. They were in the Senate itself, their presence turning the chamber from a hall of debate into a theater of terror, where every word was weighed for its potential to offend. Under this regime of fear, silence became the only safe language. Friends grew suspicious of one another. Families looked askance at their own kin. The vibrant social life of the Roman elite withered. To host a lavish party was to risk appearing too influential. To live too modestly was to risk seeming critical of the emperor's extravagance. Caligula's paranoia had atomized society, leaving each person alone with their fear. His contempt for the old traditions, particularly the Senate, became a form of sport. He delighted in humiliating the very men whose ancestors had built the Republic. He would make distinguished, elderly senators run for miles in their togas alongside his chariot, like common footmen. He would interrupt solemn debates with childish pranks or fits of uncontrollable laughter at the absurdity of it all. His ultimate mockery was centered on his beloved horse, Incitatus. After building him a marble stable and an ivory manger, he appointed the horse to a college of priests and announced his intention to make him a consul, the highest office in Rome. This was not just the act of a madman. It was a calculated gesture of supreme contempt. He was showing the Senate that his horse was more worthy of honor than any of them, that their ancient and sacred offices were meaningless toys for him to play with. His detachment from reality was most starkly displayed in his military endeavors, which devolved into bizarre and costly pantomimes of conquest. In 39 CE, he marched a massive army north into Gaul, ostensibly to suppress a rebellion and then to invade the wild, unconquered island of Britannia. The legions marched for months, a colossal expenditure of resources and manpower. They reached the coast, the English Channel churning before them. The soldiers stood ready, expecting the order to board the ships and begin the invasion. Instead, Caligula assembled them on the beach. He rode before them in full battle armor, delivered a rousing speech, and then, as the army held its breath, he declared war not on the Britons, but on Neptune, the god of the ocean. The campaign against Britannia was forgotten. The new enemy was the sea itself. He ordered the trumpets to sound the attack, and then commanded his bewildered legionaries to charge into the waves, stabbing at the water with their swords. Their final, glorious task in this war against the ocean was to collect its spoils of victory. He ordered his men to fill their helmets and the folds of their tunics with seashells, which he declared to be the treasure of the conquered sea, destined to be paraded in his triumph back in Rome. The soldiers, hardened veterans of real wars, could only obey. Their confusion mixed with a dawning, terrifying realization that their emperor, their commander-in-chief, was truly and profoundly insane. His private life was as chaotic as his public rule. He slept little, often wandering the vast, silent halls of his palace at night, calling out for the dawn to come. He ate wildly, his banquets legendary not just for their opulence, but for their bizarre and grotesque dishes. He spoke of death often with a morbid fascination. He would discuss methods of torture with his dinner guests, his eyes gleaming with excitement, or lament that his reign had not been marked by a great disaster, like a plague or a military catastrophe, that would make it truly memorable. And through it all, his belief in his own divinity hardened from a political tool into an unshakable, literal fact in his mind. He was no longer a man playing a god. He was a god trapped in the frail body of a man. He would spend hours in deep conversation with the statue of Jupiter, arguing with it as an equal. He built a private covered bridge connecting his palace on the Palatine Hill to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, so that he could visit his brother god without having to descend to the level of mere mortals. He even planned the ultimate act of divine assertion, to have a golden statue of himself erected for worship inside the Holy of Holies in the Temple of Jerusalem. This act of sacrilege, which would have undoubtedly sparked a massive bloody rebellion across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, was only averted by the cautious maneuvering of his advisors and, ultimately, by his own death. He was a god, and yet he was utterly alone. He had murdered or exiled his family, alienated his friends, and terrorized his subjects. The man who dressed as Jupiter and conversed with the moon had no one on earth he could trust. His divine power had created a cage of absolute isolation, and inside it, he paced back and forth, a lonely god rattling the bars of his own madness, waiting for the end he both feared and, perhaps, secretly craved. By the year 41 CE, the brief, sunlit morning of Caligula's reign had descended into a long and terrifying night. He had ruled for just under 4 years, a period that felt like a lifetime to the people of Rome. The city, once so joyful and filled with adoration for its golden prince, now lived in a state of perpetual anxious fear. The laughter had been replaced by silence, the cheers by whispers. The emperor, who had once been a symbol of hope, was now a source of unpredictable terror. His madness a poison that had seeped into every corner of Roman life. The Senate was cowed, the nobility decimated, and the populace weary of the grotesque spectacle of his rule. But fear, when pushed to its absolute limit, can curdle into a desperate, reckless courage. In the very halls of the palace, amidst the marble and gold that had borne witness to his divine fantasies, men began to whisper. The whispers were not of flattery or praise, but of conspiracy and assassination. The plot did not originate in the Senate, which was too broken and terrified to act. It came from the heart of Caligula's own power structure, from the one group of men who had the constant access and the military skill to strike him down, the Praetorian Guard. These were the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor's life. The same men who had hailed him as their little boots, and whose loyalty he had secured with lavish bonuses. But their loyalty had been eroded by his escalating madness and, more importantly, by his personal, humiliating insults. The conspiracy was led by a senior officer, a tribune of the Praetorian cohort named Cassius Chaerea. Chaerea was a veteran soldier, a man of dignity and courage who had served since the time of Augustus. He was not a young, ambitious upstart, but an old-school Roman officer who was deeply offended by Caligula's tyranny and his mockery of Roman tradition. His motivation, however, was also intensely personal. Caligula had singled out Chaerea for constant ridicule. The emperor mocked his voice, which was said to be high-pitched, and would taunt him with obscene and effeminate passwords when he came on duty, such as Priapus or Venus. For a hardened soldier like Chaerea, this daily public humiliation was an unbearable stain on his honor. Every taunt, every sneering joke from the emperor was another drop of fuel on the fire of his resentment. He, along with other disillusioned officers and a few brave senators who dared to join them, began to plot the end of the monster they had helped create. They waited, knowing that a single mistake would mean their own agonizing deaths. They needed the right place, the right time, a moment when the god emperor would be vulnerable. That moment came on January 24th, 41 CE, the final day of the Palatine Games, a festival held in honor of the deified Augustus. Caligula, an avid lover of the theater, had been presiding over the events all day. Around noon, he decided to leave the theater to have lunch and a bath before returning for the afternoon's performances. To get back to the palace proper, he chose not to walk through the open courtyards, but through a secluded underground passage, a cryptoporticus that ran beneath the Palatine Hill. It was a narrow, dimly lit corridor, away from the eyes of the public and the bulk of his German bodyguard. This was the moment the conspirators had been waiting for. As Caligula walked through the passage, surrounded by a small retinue of senators and palace boys, the plot was set in motion. He stopped to speak with a group of young actors from Asia Minor who was scheduled to perform later. He was in a good mood, charmed by their performance. As he lingered, the conspirators moved into position, sealing off the ends of the corridor. Cassius Chaerea approached the emperor from behind, ostensibly to ask for the password for the day. Caligula, as he always did, offered another obscene, mocking reply. It was the last insult Chaerea would ever endure. As Caligula turned to walk away, Chaerea drew his sword. "Take this," he cried, and delivered a vicious blow, striking the emperor on the neck and shoulder. Caligula staggered, wounded but not dead. He cried out in pain and tried to flee, but the narrow passage was blocked. Another conspirator, Cornelius Sabinus, shoved him to the ground. The emperor fell hard onto the marble floor. Now the rest of the plotters descended upon him in a frenzy of hate and fear. "Strike again," was the cry. They surrounded his fallen body, stabbing him wildly, relentlessly, ensuring there was no possibility of survival. They were not just killing a man. They were annihilating a monster, each blow a release of 4 years of pent-up terror and humiliation. In their fury, they mutilated his body, stabbing him over 30 times, even in the genitals. The emperor fell. Blood pooled on the cold marble. A sudden, shocking silence descended upon the corridors of power. The god who had conversed with the moon and commanded the sea lay dead in a dark passageway, his divine robes soaked in his own blood. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the man they called Caligula, was 28 years old. The assassination plunged the palace into chaos. The emperor's loyal German bodyguards, hearing the commotion, finally arrived, but it was too late. Enraged, they began to kill indiscriminately, cutting down innocent senators, servants, and even some of the conspirators in their blind fury. Meanwhile, a separate group of assassins sought to extinguish Caligula's line completely. They burst into the imperial apartments and found his wife, the Empress Melonia Caesonia, weeping over her husband's body. Without hesitation, they ran her through with a sword. Then they found their final target, Julia Drusilla, Caligula's infant daughter. In a final act of brutal symbolism, a soldier seized the toddler by the feet and smashed her head against a wall. In the aftermath, Caligula's body was taken away under the cover of darkness and buried in a shallow, unmarked grave in the Lamian Gardens, a hasty and ignominious end for a man who had claimed divinity. The Senate, overjoyed at their liberation, immediately moved to condemn his memory. They ordered his statues to be torn down, his name to be erased from all public inscriptions, and his acts to be nullified. They wanted to wipe him from history, to pretend the nightmare had never happened. But the story of Caligula, the boy who became a monster, would prove impossible to erase, a permanent scar on the memory of Rome. Caligula's rule lasted just 1,400 days, a mere flicker in the grand centuries-long timeline of the Roman Empire. It was a reign shorter than a single term of a modern president, a brief and violent fever that broke as suddenly as it began. And yet his name lives on. It is a name that has defied the Senate's condemnation, a name that could not be chiseled from the memory of the world. It is whispered in the hushed halls of museums, debated in classrooms, and brought to life in all its terrifying glory on stage and screen. While the names of wiser, better emperors have faded into academic obscurity, the name Caligula still has the power to shock, to fascinate, and to horrify. His story leaves us with a cascade of unsettling questions, questions that historians have wrestled with for 2 millennia. Was he truly mad? Did some latent illness, awakened by the fever that nearly killed him, shatter his mind and unleash the monster within? Or was he simply profoundly cruel, a man who discovered that he enjoyed inflicting pain and fear, a sadist gifted with the ultimate power to indulge his darkest appetites? Was he a broken man, a victim of a childhood so steeped in grief and terror that he could only recreate the trauma that had been inflicted upon him? Or was he the ultimate proof of the old axiom that absolute power corrupts absolutely, his soul methodically eroded by the intoxicating, poisonous belief that he could do anything he wished without consequence? We may never know the precise alchemy that created him. The truth is likely not a simple answer, but a complex and tragic fusion of all these things. He was the traumatized boy who survived by becoming a perfect actor, the paranoid man who saw enemies in every shadow, the spoiled youth who inherited the world, and the absolute ruler who discovered the terrible thrill of tyranny. The lines between these identities blurred until they became one, a seamless monster wearing the handsome face of a prince. What we do know, with chilling certainty, is this: Caligula was given stewardship of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. It was a sophisticated machine of law, commerce, and military might, a complex tapestry of cultures and peoples held together by tradition and the authority of the emperor. And in just a few short years, he turned it all into a theater of fear. This was his unique and terrible genius. He did not merely rule, he performed. The Roman Empire became his personal stage, and its citizens, from the highest senator to the lowest slave, were his unwilling cast and captive audience. The script was written fresh each day, dictated by his whims. One day, the play was a divine comedy, with the emperor dressed as Jupiter, conversing with the moon. The next, it was a dark and bloody tragedy, with the execution of a friend or the humiliation of a noble family as the main event. He understood, perhaps better than any tyrant before or since, that unpredictable performance was the ultimate tool of control. His subjects never knew what to expect, and so they lived in a constant state of anxiety, their lives reduced to waiting for their next cue in his terrifying drama. But now, that theater is dark. The great, blood-soaked performance is over. The curtain has fallen, not with applause, but with the swift, desperate violence of a backstage mutiny. The stage is empty. The gilded sets of the palace are silent. The marble floors scrubbed clean of the blood. The audience has dispersed, their relief palpable in the quiet air. The gods, whom he alternately impersonated, worshipped, and insulted, are silent once more, their temples restored to their proper reverence, their marble ears no longer forced to listen to the ravings of a mortal who dared to call them his peers. And the little boots have stopped walking. That name, Caligula, once a term of endearment shouted with laughter by hardened legionaries as they watched a beloved child march in the dust of their camp, became a name whispered with terror in the darkened corridors of the palace. It is the story of a name, the story of how a symbol of innocence and hope can be twisted into a byword for tyranny. The journey from the sunny military camps of the Rhine to that dark, bloody passageway beneath the Palatine Hill was a journey into the deepest abyss of the human soul. The sound of those little boots, once the sound of a bright future, became the footsteps of a monster. And now, at last, that sound is gone, leaving behind only a profound and chilling silence, a void in history where a golden prince once stood. And now, dear listener, our story slows. The frantic, galloping pace of a life lived at the edge of madness gives way to something else entirely. The narrative, which has burned so brightly and so violently, now softens, its edges blurring as the heat dissipates. The wind has stilled. The hot, angry gusts of rumor and rebellion that once swept through the streets of Rome have died down, leaving a profound and heavy calm in their wake. The Roman candles, those human torches that illuminated the grotesque garden parties of a tyrant, have burned out, their last embers extinguished by the steady, patient hand of time. The spectacle is over. We have walked together through the story of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the man they called Caligula. We have followed him through the gleaming marble halls of the Palatine Palace, halls that echoed with his laughter, his rage, and his terrifying, whimsical decrees. We have descended with him into the labyrinth of his own madness, a place of talking statues and divine fantasies, where an empire was held hostage by a single fractured mind. And finally, we have followed him into memory, that quiet, eternal archive where all emperors, good and evil, must eventually reside. The journey has been tumultuous, a whirlwind of blood and gold, of fear and pity. But now, it is time to stand still. Let your breath, which may have caught in your throat at the tales of cruelty, now rise and fall in a slow, steady rhythm. Let your thoughts, which may have raced to keep up with the emperor's frantic energy, now settle like dust motes in a sunbeam. There is no more chaos to navigate, no more horror to anticipate. The story is told. The end has been written. Another emperor waits in the wings. Of course he does. History is a relentless stage, and the exit of one actor is always the cue for another's entrance. In the confusion following Caligula's assassination, a trembling, forgotten figure named Claudius, his uncle, was found hiding behind a curtain and was unexpectedly hailed as the new Caesar. Another life, with its own unique triumphs and tragedies, is ready to begin. Another tale, with its own lessons on power, loyalty, and betrayal, is waiting to be told. But for now, we rest. We do not rush to the next drama. We linger here, in the space between stories, in the profound and necessary silence that follows a great and terrible noise. This is a moment to absorb what is past, to feel the weight and the texture of the history we have just witnessed. It is in these quiet interludes that the true meaning of the past often reveals itself. Think of it as the quiet after a great storm has passed over the city. The thunder has ceased its violent rattling of the heavens. The lashing rain is gone. The sky, once a bruised and angry purple, is now washed clean, pale and serene. The citizens emerge from their homes, not to chaos, but to a world transformed. A world of glistening streets and a stillness that feels both peaceful and unnerving. This is the quiet we now inhabit. The storm of Caligula's reign has passed, and in its wake, we are left to survey the damage and marvel at the simple fact of survival. This is the hush of history's long, slow sleep. The frantic, day-to-day struggles of individual lives. which feel so all-consuming and urgent to those who live them, are eventually smoothed over by the immense, slow-moving glaciers of time. The passions, the ambitions, the loves, and the hatreds that defined a person's existence are slowly ground down, polished, and deposited as part of a vast, silent landscape. Caligula's desperate need for divinity, Sharia's burning shame, the Senate's terror, the people's adoration and subsequent fear, all these white-hot emotions have cooled over the centuries into historical fact, into stories we can examine with a dispassionate eye. The screaming has stopped, the blood has dried, the marble has been scrubbed clean, or torn down and repurposed for some other, later dream. All the noise and fury of those 1,400 days have been absorbed into the great, deep quiet of the past. It is a quiet not of emptiness, but of fullness, like the silence of a vast library at midnight, where millions of stories and lives rest peacefully on the shelves, their voices waiting to be awakened, but content for now in their slumber. In this quiet, we can feel the true legacy of a story like Caligula's. It is not just a chronicle of events, but a meditation on the enduring fragility of reason and the seductive nature of power. We are left with the echo of a question. How thin is the veil that separates a leader from a monster, a society from a spectacle? We are left with the image of those little boots, a symbol of how innocence can be corrupted, and how a name given in love can become a synonym for terror. So let us remain here for a moment longer. Let us not be too quick to turn the page. Let the story of the monster god settle within you. Feel the weight of his brief, explosive time on Earth, and then feel the immense, quiet peace of the 2,000 years that have passed since he fell. The contrast is where the lesson lies. The chaos was fleeting. The quiet is eternal. The stage is empty. The gods are silent. And the little boots have stopped walking. And so, we leave Caligula behind. The madness quiets. The daggers have fallen. The corridors echo once more with cautious footsteps. Rome, bruised but breathing, stumbles onward. Time flows as it always does. Emperors come and go. Claudius, quiet and bookish. Nero, bold and burning. Vespasian, Titus, Domitian, each adding their verse to the long song of Rome. And then, much later, the empire finds calm. A century passes, and Rome is ruled by a man of wisdom, Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher king, a ruler who wrote meditations instead of manifestos, who led armies not for glory, but from duty. The people called it a golden time. The Senate praised him. The empire felt whole. But even the wisest emperor must someday die. And when he did, the throne passed not to a council, nor a general, nor a trusted advisor. It passed to his son, a boy raised in palaces, fed on honeyed words, dressed in silk, surrounded not by philosophers, but flatterers. His name was Commodus, and though his reign began in peace, it would end in blood, in sand, and in the roar of the arena. So if you're still with me, if your eyes haven't yet fallen closed, let's continue. Let's slip now into the year 180 CE. The fires of the frontier are still smoldering. The empire stretches wide. And in the heart of Rome, a young man takes the crown. Let's meet him. Let's meet Commodus. The year is 180 CE. The wind, a relentless and chilling force, rustles the tall, pale grass on the northern frontier. It is a wind that carries no scent of the city, no hint of warm bread, incense, or the press of humanity. Instead, it smells of damp earth, pine, and the coming thaw. Here, on the bleak edge of the Roman world, in the cold, thin air of distant Germania, the might of the empire is a tangible thing. A sprawling camp of leather tents and wooden palisades, a disciplined city of soldiers huddled against a foreign wilderness. For years, this has been the heart of the empire, for where the emperor is, there is Rome. But today, a profound and dreadful silence has fallen over the camp. The Roman army mourns. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, has died. There was no grand drama to his passing, no palace intrigue or battlefield glory. His final breaths were quiet and composed, drawn in a simple campaign tent, surrounded not by sycophants, but by his generals and his stoic philosophy. He met death as he had met life, with duty, discipline, and deep, reflective thought. For nearly 2 decades, he had been the weary guardian of the Roman peace, a man who would have preferred the quiet of a library, but who spent his reign in the saddle, repelling invasions and securing the borders. His death marks the end of an era, a long twilight struggle guided by a man who saw power not as a prize, but as a profound and heavy burden. The soldiers, men hardened by years of brutal warfare against the Germanic tribes, bow their heads. They were not close to him. He was a distant, intellectual figure, more a father than a brother in arms, but they respected him. They respected his tireless dedication, his presence among them in this harsh land, and the quiet strength that seemed to emanate from him. With his passing, the soul of the camp seems to have been extinguished. The world, from the misty shores of Britannia to the sun-scorched sands of Syria, holds its breath. The last of the 5 good emperors is gone. And then, amidst the grief and uncertainty, a new emperor is named. The succession is not in doubt. It has been planned for years. The title does not pass to a battle-hardened general, a man who has earned his command through years of service on the frontier. It does not go to a wise and experienced senator, chosen for his administrative skill and political acumen. The most powerful position in the known world passes, by right of birth, to a boy. His name is Lucius Aurelius Commodus. He's just 18 years old. He is the son of the philosopher, but he is nothing like his father. Where Marcus was slight, thoughtful, and burdened by duty, Commodus is tall, powerfully built, and blessed with the handsome, aristocratic features of his imperial line. He looks like a Roman god, like a statue of Hercules come to life. But behind the perfect facade, there is a profound emptiness. He is bored. He's bored by the endless talk of strategy, by the logistics of supply lines, by the solemn duties of state. He's bored by the cold, the mud, and the grim-faced soldiers who surround him. His entire life has been an education in stoic virtue, in self-restraint and public service, but the lessons never took root. He has been raised in a world of discipline, and he has come to despise it. He is utterly and dangerously unprepared for the power that is now his. The moment of his acclamation is a study in contrasts. The seasoned generals and advisors of his father, men with gray in their beards and the weight of the empire on their shoulders, pledge their allegiance to a teenager whose primary interests are gladiatorial combat and the pleasures of the flesh. They look at him and see the son of the man they revered, hoping to find an echo of the father's greatness. But they see only a handsome, sullen youth, his eyes already distant, already dreaming of the warmth, luxury, and adulation of Rome. Commodus does not want to be here, on this cold frontier. He does not care about securing the borders or fulfilling his father's strategic vision. He wants the triumph, but not the war. He wants the glory, but not the responsibility. His first act as emperor is not to rally the troops or plan the final phase of the campaign, but to seek the quickest possible way to abandon it. He listens impatiently as his father's advisors urge him to finish the war, to secure a permanent and lasting victory that will protect the empire for generations. They speak of duty, of honor, of his father's legacy. Commodus hears only the droning of old men who are keeping him from the life he feels he deserves. He makes a hasty and disadvantageous peace with the German tribes, effectively undoing years of hard-won gains. He showers the army with a massive donative, buying their loyalty rather than earning it. And then, with a speed that shocks the old guard, he packs up the imperial court and abandons the frontier. He races back toward Rome, toward the cheering crowds, the magnificent palaces, and the thrilling spectacle of the arena. The soldiers watch him go, their grief for Marcus now tinged with a deep and unsettling apprehension. They have a new emperor, one who looks the part, but they sense the hollowness within. They have traded a philosopher for a performer, a stoic for a hedonist, a guardian for a child. He is the emperor now, the absolute master of 100 million souls. The boy who was bored by his father's lessons now holds the fate of the world in his hands. And as his chariot thunders south toward the heart of the empire, Rome prepares to celebrate the arrival of its new, youthful ruler, unaware that the age of wisdom has just ended, and an age of indulgence, cruelty, and spectacular decay is about to begin. Commodus was born into gold, not the metaphorical gold of wealth and opportunity that touches the lives of the aristocracy, but the literal, shimmering, and soul-defining gold of the imperial palace. He was the first son born to a reigning emperor in nearly a century, a boy who drew his first breath not in a provincial villa or a Roman townhouse, but in the purple, a phrase that signified a child born during their father's reign, a life destined from its first cry for the throne. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was a man of books and scrolls, of quiet contemplation and profound philosophical depth. His world was the Stoics' world, a place of duty, reason, self-restraint, and a heavy, ever-present sense of responsibility to the gods and to the people of Rome. He saw the empire not as his property, but as his sacred charge. His pleasures were found in the dense arguments of Epictetus, in the quiet solitude of his study, and in the difficult daily practice of virtue. He was a man who wore the imperial purple like a heavy woolen cloak on a hot day, a necessary burden, not a comfortable garment. His mother, Faustina the Younger, the daughter of the previous emperor, Antoninus Pius, was a woman of noble and admired lineage. She was the living link between two imperial generations, a figure of grace and fertility who had given the empire what it had long craved, a male heir. While Marcus was burdened by the philosophical weight of his position, Faustina seemed to embrace its splendor. Her world was one of public ceremony, imperial tours, and the adoration of the masses. And at the center of her world was her beautiful, healthy son, Commodus. He was not just a child. He was the culmination of a dynasty, the guarantee of a stable succession, a divine gift to the imperial house. And so, Commodus was raised in the strange, gilded space between these two worlds. He was not raised on the rugged battlefields where his father spent so much of his reign, nor in the politically charged halls of the Senate where power was brokered and debated. His world was a carefully curated paradise, an imperial bubble designed to protect and pamper the future of Rome. He grew up in the sprawling gardens of the imperial villas, like the one at Lanuvium, places of breathtaking beauty with manicured lawns, sparkling fountains, and private menageries filled with exotic animals from the farthest corners of the empire. He had tutors, the most learned men from Athens and Alexandria, who were tasked with filling his head with history, rhetoric, and his father's Stoic philosophy. He had servants who catered to his every whim, who were there to catch him when he stumbled and applaud him when he succeeded. He had toys from across the empire, miniature chariots from Gaul, carved wooden soldiers from Syria, and stories of gods and heroes whispered to him in Greek and Latin. But the lessons of his father, the stern lectures on duty and virtue, were like water on marble. While Marcus saw a map of the empire as a sacred responsibility, a web of lives he was sworn to protect, Commodus saw a floor on which to roll dice. While Marcus read the histories of past rulers to learn from their mistakes, Commodus preferred the thrilling, visceral tales of gladiators and mythological beasts. His education was a constant, gentle collision between the world his father wanted for him, a world of the mind and of duty, and the world he wanted for himself, a world of the body, of pleasure, and of applause. Crucially, his upbringing was fundamentally different from that of the four emperors who preceded his father. The era of the 5 good emperors was defined by a unique system of succession. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius had all been adopted. They were chosen men, selected in their maturity for their proven skill, their military prowess, their administrative talent, and their sound character. They had to earn the throne. They had to climb the ladder of Roman public life, serving as generals, governors, and senators. They understood the mechanics of the empire because they had been its mechanics. They knew the weight of power because they had felt it settle on their shoulders gradually, not dropped upon them in the cradle. Marcus Aurelius himself was a product of this system, chosen by Hadrian and groomed for decades by his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius. He had spent a lifetime preparing for a role he did not necessarily want. This system, a meritocracy born of circumstance, had given the empire nearly a century of unparalleled stability and prosperity. The birth of Commodus changed everything. It broke the chain of adoption. For the first time in generations, the succession was not a choice based on merit, but a fact based on blood. Commodus was the first to inherit the throne directly from his father since the disastrous reign of Domitian, and that fact shaped his entire existence. He did not grow up with the hunger of a soldier trying to prove his worth to his general. He did not grow up with the humility of a senator who had to persuade his peers and defer to his superiors. He never had to earn respect because respect was his birthright. He never had to learn the art of compromise because his every desire was met. He never had to understand the lives of ordinary people because he had never been one. The lessons of struggle, of failure, of patience, the very experiences that forge character were entirely absent from his life. His tutors could teach him philosophy, but they could not teach him humility. His servants could give him anything he wanted, but they could not give him a sense of perspective. His father could lecture him on the duties of a ruler, but he could not make him feel the weight of those duties. The unspoken lesson that Commodus learned every single day, the lesson that drowned out all others, was simple. You are different. You are special. This entire world exists for you. He grew up expecting power, not as a burden to be carried or a trust to be honored, but as a right to be enjoyed. It was his property, his inheritance, his ultimate plaything. The boy who was born in the purple was being perfectly trained to be a divine ruler, but he was receiving no training at all in how to be a good man. At first, Rome welcomed him with an outpouring of relief and adoration. When Commodus made his grand entrance into the city, abandoning the grim northern frontier his father had died to protect, the people saw not a dereliction of duty, but the return of the sun. They saw a young, vibrant, and impossibly handsome emperor, a living statue of Hercules who promised an end to the endless, costly wars that had defined his father's reign. The city erupted in celebration. Triumphal arches were hastily erected. The streets were strewn with flowers, and the air was thick with the scent of celebratory incense and the roar of a hopeful crowd. The Senate, eager to curry favor with their new master, honored him with every title and accolade they could devise. They praised his wisdom in securing a swift peace, conveniently ignoring the fact that it was a peace bought on disadvantageous terms. The people, weary of the austerity and solemnity of Marcus Aurelius's long and difficult rule, cheered him with genuine affection. He was the son of their beloved philosopher, but he was also a vision of youth and vitality. Coins were struck bearing his youthful, heroic face, spreading the image of a new golden age to every corner of the empire. And for a time, a fragile stability held. Commodus, having achieved his primary goal of returning to the pleasures of the capital, had little interest in the tedious day-to-day business of governance. He was content to let others rule in his name. The ship of state was steered by the steady hands of the men his father had trusted older, wiser figures who understood the intricate machinery of the empire. Men like his Praetorian prefect, Tartinius Paternus, a seasoned military commander, handled the army and matters of security. The palace itself and the immense bureaucracy of the court fell under the influence of Soterius, a charming chamberlain from Bithynia, and later, the powerful and ambitious freedman, Marcus Aurelius Clender. These men handled the petitions, managed the finances, and guided the empire's hand, while the emperor himself pursued a life of dedicated leisure. Commodus's world shrank to the confines of the imperial palaces and their sprawling gardens. His days were a carefully orchestrated symphony of indulgence. He bathed in exotic oils imported from Egypt and Arabia, his baths attended by servants who catered to his every need. He lounged for hours in perfumed gardens, reclining on silk cushions as musicians played soft melodies and fountains whispered in the background. He delighted in lavish, protracted meals under painted ceilings, where he could sample rare delicacies, the tongues of nightingales, the brains of peacocks, and drink the finest Falernian wine from jewel-encrusted goblets. His companions were not senators or generals, but dancers, actors, charioteers, and beautiful courtesans. His life was a constant, glittering festival, a deliberate rejection of the cold, disciplined stoicism his father had embodied. He had inherited the world, and he intended to enjoy it as his personal playground. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a profound restlessness began to stir within him. The endless cycle of pleasure began to feel hollow. The cheers of the crowd during his public appearances felt distant and impersonal. He realized they were cheering for the office, not the man. They were applauding the purple toga, the imperial title, the memory of his father. Their adoration was a political necessity, a conditioned response. It lacked the fire, the passion, the raw, visceral connection he craved. He wanted something more than the passive authority of governance. He had no interest in the slow, grinding work of reform, the tedious task of hearing legal appeals, or the complex challenge of managing the grain supply. That was work for lesser men, for the Cleanders and the Paternuses of the world. He wanted glory, but the traditional avenues to Roman glory held no appeal for him. He did not want the glory of conquest. That meant mud, cold, and the company of rough soldiers on some distant, miserable frontier. He had already abandoned that life and had no intention of returning to it. He did not want the glory of a great builder or lawgiver. That meant poring over architectural plans and debating legal codes with dusty old senators. It was boring, intellectual work, the world of his father. The glory Commodus craved was something more dramatic, more immediate, and intensely personal. He wanted the adoration of the masses, but he wanted to earn it himself on his own terms. He wanted them to roar not because he was the emperor, but because of what he could do. He wanted to be the center of the spectacle, not just its sponsor. He yearned for the kind of worship that was given to a rock star, a sports hero, a living legend. He wanted to be loved not as an emperor, but as something more primal, more exciting. He wanted to be a god, not in the abstract, political sense that Roman emperors were deified after their death, but a living, breathing god on earth, a deity of physical perfection and power. He wanted to be a hero, a modern-day Hercules whose mighty deeds were witnessed and worshipped by millions. And above all, with a burning, obsessive passion that would come to define his reign, he wanted to be a gladiator. In the arena, a man was judged by his strength, his skill, his courage, and his grace. A gladiator, if he was successful, was the most adored figure in Roman society. He was a sex symbol, a hero, a god of the sands. His victories were real, tangible things, won with his own sweat and blood. The roar of the crowd in the Colosseum was not a polite cheer for a distant ruler. It was a thunderous primal scream of pure adoration. This was the glory Commodus desired. He, who already possessed the body of a Greek statue, began to see the arena as his true calling, his natural stage. Why should he sit in the imperial box, watching lesser men fight, when he himself was stronger, more handsome, more divine than any of them? The idea took root in his mind and grew into a powerful obsession. He would not just rule the Roman world, he would become its greatest entertainer. He would descend from the lonely pedestal of the emperor and enter the bloody, glorious world of the arena, where he could finally win the kind of worship he so desperately craved. The bored boy god had found his purpose. Commodus had a fascination, a deep, burning, and all-consuming obsession with the arena. To the traditional Roman mind, the Colosseum was a place of spectacle, of brutal entertainment, and of state-sponsored violence. It was a place for slaves, criminals, and prisoners of war to fight and die for the amusement of the masses. For an emperor to be interested in the games was normal. For an emperor to be obsessed with them to the exclusion of all else was a sign of a profound and dangerous sickness of the soul. His obsession began in the private courtyards of the palace. He summoned the greatest gladiatorial trainers, men whose entire lives were dedicated to the art of killing, to be his personal tutors. At first, he trained with blunted wooden swords, learning the basic stances, the parries, the lunges. He was a diligent student, his powerful physique making him a natural. He possessed a grace and coordination that his tutors, mindful of their own safety, were quick to praise. He spent hours each day practicing, his body gleaming with sweat, his mind focused not on matters of state, but on the precise angle of a sword thrust. Soon, the wooden swords were not enough. He graduated to real ones, their steel edges sharp and deadly. He studied the distinct movements of every type of champion, the heavy, defensive style of the secutor, the nimble, net and trident dance of the retiarius. He learned to handle the bow with astonishing accuracy and to hurl a javelin with deadly force. The gardens of the imperial palace, once places of philosophical discussion under his father, were transformed into private training grounds. The grunts of exertion and the clash of steel replaced the quiet murmur of debate. He was no longer playing a part. He was honing a craft. And then, one day, he decided the private stage was no longer sufficient. His skill, his divine prowess, needed to be seen, to be worshipped by the entire world. In an act that shattered every remaining Roman conception of imperial dignity, he announced that he would personally step into the sand of the arena. Imagine the shock that rippled through the city. The Emperor Augustus, the Pater Patriae, the Pontifex Maximus, the living embodiment of Roman majesty and law, was going to perform as a gladiator. It was an act of such profound degradation that it was almost incomprehensible. It was as if a god had declared his intention to become a common street performer. The Senate was horrified, their silent disapproval a palpable force within the Curia. The people were stunned, unsure how to react. His first appearance was a spectacle of calculated divinity and breathtaking arrogance. He did not enter the arena in the simple loincloth of a common gladiator. He presented himself as a living god. He wore a lion's skin draped over his shoulders, a direct imitation of the mythological hero Hercules, with whom he now claimed a special kinship. His helmets were not made of simple bronze, but were gilded in gold, shimmering in the sun. The weapons he carried were not standard issue. They were exquisitely crafted, carved with his name and divine titles, their hilts inlaid with ivory and jewels. He was not a man descending to the level of a gladiator. He was a god condescending to grace the arena with his presence. The events themselves were carefully choreographed shams, designed to showcase his skill without exposing him to any genuine danger. He would fight wild beasts, but not in the perilous way a professional hunter might. He would stand on a protected platform, safely elevated above the fray, and rain down arrows or javelins upon helpless animals driven towards him by beaters. He once killed 100 lions in a single day in this manner, a display not of courage, but of relentless assembly line slaughter. He slaughtered giraffes, elephants, and ostriches, exotic creatures whose deaths were meant to signify his mastery over the entire natural world. When he deigned to fight human opponents, the contests were even more one-sided. He did not face the champions of the gladiatorial schools in their prime. His opponents were gladiators who were already wounded from previous contests, or men who were deliberately weakened, sometimes even hobbled. Often, they were armed with blunted or lead-weighted weapons that could do no real harm. Their instructions were simple and terrifying. Provide a good show, make the emperor look invincible, and above all, do not, under any circumstances, land a telling blow. To scratch the emperor would mean a slow and agonizing death. And so, they would stumble, parry weakly, and fall dramatically at the prescribed moment. Their defeat, a testament to Commodus's divine strength. The reaction of the crowd was a study in collective cognitive dissonance. At first, when the emperor made his grand entrance, a stunned, unnatural silence would fall over the tens of thousands packed into the Colosseum. They were witnessing a sacrilege, a violation of the natural order of things. This was their emperor, their god on earth, behaving like a common entertainer. The silence was thick with confusion and a creeping sense of dread. But Commodus craved applause. He would raise his arms, basking in the silent awe, and then the cheering would begin. It started slowly, hesitantly, driven by the professional claques he had planted in the crowd. Then it would swell, growing into a thunderous roar. But it was not the sound of genuine admiration. It was the sound of fear. The people cheered because they had to. They cheered because they knew the emperor was watching, his spies scattered among them, noting who was not sufficiently enthusiastic. They cheered because their lives and the lives of their families depended on playing their part in this grotesque imperial theater. They roared their approval for the emperor who was debasing their most sacred office. Their cheers, a desperate act of self-preservation. They did not admire him. They feared him. And for Commodus, who had long since ceased to distinguish between the two emotions, their fear was the sweetest applause of all. The sand of the arena, stained with the blood of beasts and men, was no longer a large enough stage for Commodus's ego. The roar of the frightened crowd, which he mistook for genuine adoration, was a drug that demanded ever-increasing doses. Soon, simple gladiatorial matches, even his carefully choreographed victories, were not enough. His obsession with glory began to overflow the walls of the Colosseum, seeking to remake the entire Roman world in his own divine image. The performance of being a hero had to become the reality of the empire. His megalomania first took aim at the very fabric of time itself. The Roman calendar, a structure that had ordered the lives of citizens for centuries, became his personal canvas. He declared that the 12 months of the year would no longer be known by their ancient names. January, February, March. These were the names of a bygone era, the era of mortals. The new age, the age of Commodus, required a new calendar. He renamed all 12 months after his own extensive list of names, titles, and self-proclaimed epithets. The year now consisted of Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculius, Romanus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, and Pius. To live in Rome was now to have your life measured by the emperor's vanity. A farmer planting his crops in what was once April was now doing so in the month of Commodus. A merchant closing his books at the end of December was now doing so at the end of Pius. It was an act of supreme arrogance, an assertion that time itself began and ended with him. Having conquered time, he turned his attention to space. The city of Rome, the urbs aeterna, the eternal city, with its thousand-year history and its sacred identity as the heart of civilization, was to be rebranded. In a decree that struck the remaining traditionalists as the ultimate sacrilege, he declared that the city would henceforth be known as Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The name implied that Rome was not the mother city of the world, but his own personal settlement, a place he had founded anew as if he were a new Romulus. The Roman people were no longer citizens of a proud republic and empire. They were colonists living on the property of their divine landlord. The legions were renamed the Commodianae, and the Senate, in a final act of humiliation, was to be called the Commodian Fortunate Senate. This rebranding was accompanied by a physical transformation of the city's landscape. Statues of the old gods and past emperors were torn down, replaced by a single recurring image, Commodus as Hercules. All across the city, magnificent new statues rose, each one a testament to his divine fantasy. They depicted his face with its handsome, arrogant features carved onto the impossibly muscular body of the demigod Hercules. There he was, muscles bulging, veins like ropes on his marble arms, a massive club resting on his shoulder, the skin of the Nemean lion draped across his powerful frame. He was no longer just the emperor. He was the city's official deity, its patron hero, its divine protector. His public appearances became increasingly bizarre, blurring the line between imperial ceremony and theatrical performance. He would parade through the city, not in the purple toga of an emperor, but in the lion skin of Hercules. He would ride in magnificent chariots, not to celebrate a military victory, but to celebrate himself, tossing handfuls of specially minted coins to the crowds, coins that bore his face as Hercules on one side and his new divine titles on the other. The Roman elite, particularly the senators, were forced to become participants in this grand, mad theater. They were commanded to attend his gladiatorial performances, not as spectators, but as a mandatory chorus of approval. For hours, these proud, dignified men, many from families that had served the state for generations, were made to stand and applaud as the emperor slaughtered helpless animals or defeated crippled opponents. They had to chant his new titles, hailing him as the Roman Hercules, the new founder of Rome, the greatest and most skilled of all mankind. Their applause was not just requested, it was scrutinized. A senator who did not clap with sufficient vigor, whose face did not show the proper degree of rapturous adoration, would be noted by the emperor's spies. Such a lapse could lead to the loss of property, exile, or a quiet summons from which one never returned. He now declared himself the living Hercules, the reincarnation of the demigod on earth. And this was not a metaphor. It was not a poetic comparison or a political tool. In the echo chamber of his own mind, surrounded by sycophants who confirmed his every delusion, he had come to believe it as literal fact. He was a god, and the world was his temple. To speak against him, even to whisper in doubt, was therefore not just treason against the state. It was blasphemy against a living God. And blasphemy was a crime that was punished with terrifying swiftness. The climate of fear that had begun with his gladiatorial performances now became a suffocating, citywide paranoia. A joke told at a private dinner party could be reported by a slave seeking favor. A historian who wrote too favorably of a past emperor could be accused of implicitly criticizing the current one. A philosopher who taught the Stoic virtues of humility and self-restraint, the very virtues of Commodus's father, was committing a dangerous act of subversion. The danger was in the smallest of things. It was in failing to offer a pinch of incense at one of his new statues. It was in looking away when his chariot passed. It was in a moment of silence when thunderous applause was required. Commodus, like all tyrants who build their power on fear, saw dissent everywhere. His spies were everywhere, his cruelty was legendary, and his ego was infinitely fragile. The most powerful empire in the world had been transformed into the personal cult of a man who thought he was a god, and to live, there was to walk on eggshells, to wear a permanent mask of adoration, and to know that a single wrong word could be your last. It was very dangerous indeed. Behind the forced cheers and the garish pageantry of the Colonia Commodiana, a deep and abiding fear took root in the heart of Rome. The city had become a grand stage for its emperor's fantasies. But for the actors, the senators, the nobles, the common citizens, the performance was a matter of life and death. The public spectacle of the god emperor was sustained by a private reality of purges, paranoia, and state-sanctioned corruption. Commodus, in his quest for unchallenged adoration, began to systematically eliminate any person or idea that represented a connection to his father's world. The sober, dutiful men who had guided the empire in his early years were the first to go. He executed his most capable rivals, men whose competence and popularity he perceived as a threat to his own. Tarquinius Paternus, the respected Praetorian prefect who had served Marcus Aurelius with distinction, was accused of conspiracy and summarily killed. Philosophers, whose teachings on Stoic virtue and self-restraint were an implicit rebuke to his decadent lifestyle, were exiled or forced into silence. The intellectual and moral foundations of his father's court were methodically dismantled. Into this vacuum of integrity flooded a new class of ruler, the flatterers and the favorites. Power was no longer granted on the basis of merit, experience, or loyalty to the state, but in direct exchange for praise. The men who rose to the highest positions were those who applauded the loudest at the arena, who were quickest to hail Commodus as the living Hercules, and who were most adept at indulging his every whim. His chamberlain, Clender, a former Phrygian slave, rose to become the most powerful man in the empire, wielding immense influence and amassing a colossal personal fortune. Under this new regime, the institutions of the state were put up for sale. The ancient and honored offices of the Roman Republic became commodities to be sold to the highest bidders. Governorships of entire provinces, command of legions, even the consulship itself, could be purchased for the right price, with the gold flowing directly into the emperor's perpetually depleted treasury. Justice was no longer blind. It was sold. Favorable verdicts, imperial pardons, and lucrative government contracts were all available for a fee. The empire was no longer a state to be governed, but an asset to be liquidated. Its honor and tradition sold off to fund the emperor's increasingly bizarre and expensive lifestyle. While the empire rotted from within, the emperor himself descended further into his own private world. The palace, once a center of administration, became a fortress of his paranoia and a stage for his delusions. He walked the magnificent halls at night, not in the robes of an emperor, but in the leather and bronze of a gladiator. Servants would whisper of seeing him in the moonlight, shadowboxing with ghosts, practicing his moves against imaginary foes, his powerful body glistening with sweat as he relived his victories in the sand. His break from reality was so complete that he no longer saw a distinction between his public performance and his private life. There are tales of him appearing at formal state dinners, attended by the most distinguished senators and their wives, with the blood and grime of the day's games still on his hands and arms. He would recline on his couch, a living embodiment of his own brutal spectacle, his presence a terrifying reminder that the savage rules of the arena now applied to the highest echelons of society. He forced his guests to look upon the evidence of his slaughter, their polite conversation a thin veneer over their revulsion and fear. But fear cannot be maintained at such a fever pitch forever. Eventually, it must either break the spirit of the oppressed or ignite the courage of the desperate. The first serious challenge to his rule came not from a distant general or a resentful senate, but from within his own bloodline. His older sister, Lucilla, was a woman as proud and ambitious as Commodus was decadent. She was an Augusta, the daughter of one emperor and the widow of another, Lucius Verus. She had grown up at the center of power and could not abide the spectacle of her brother debasing their family name and the imperial office. Her resentment was fueled by jealousy. Her own position at court had been eclipsed by that of Commodus's wife, and a genuine disgust for what Rome had become under his rule. Around the year 182 CE, she became the heart of a dangerous conspiracy. A group of senators, equally horrified by the emperor's behavior, gathered around her. The plot was simple and direct. They would assassinate the emperor and restore some semblance of order. The man chosen to strike the blow was a young nobleman who lunged at Commodus in a darkened passageway as he was entering the theater. But in his zeal, the assassin made a fatal error. As he drew his dagger, he brandished it before the emperor and shouted, "This is what the Senate sends you." The theatrical declaration, intended to give the act a veneer of political legitimacy, gave the emperor's bodyguards a precious second to react. They seized the attacker before he could land a fatal blow. The plot had failed. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Commodus, his paranoia now given terrifying justification, unleashed a wave of terror upon the aristocracy. The conspirators were rounded up, tortured, and executed. Anyone even remotely connected to the plot was eliminated. Lucilla herself, despite being the emperor's sister, was shown no mercy. Her imperial blood could not save her. First, she was stripped of her wealth and exiled to the desolate island of Capri. Then, sometime later, on Commodus's orders, a centurion was dispatched to the island. Her death was quiet, unceremonious, and absolute. The execution of an Augusta sent a shockwave of terror through the Roman elite. It was a message of unparalleled clarity and loudness, ringing in the silent, fearful halls of every noble villa. If Commodus would not hesitate to execute his own sister, the daughter of the deified Marcus Aurelius, then no one was safe. No name was noble enough, no lineage sacred enough to protect them from his rage. The last vestiges of organized opposition were crushed. The message was clear. This emperor would not be challenged. He was truly alone on his divine pedestal, and from that lonely height, everyone else was mortal, and therefore disposable. As Commodus played in the sun-drenched sand of the arena, a deep and pervasive decay began to rot the foundations of the Roman world. While the emperor was busy living out his divine fantasies, the vast and complex machinery of the empire, left without a guiding hand, started to seize up and break down. The city of Rome, the glorious heart of civilization, began to show the symptoms of a profound sickness, a malaise that emanated directly from the throne. The corruption that had begun with the rise of his favorites now spread like a plague through every level of the administration. With the emperor's favor and all public offices for sale, a man's worth was measured not by his integrity or experience, but by the weight of his purse. The courts of law became marketplaces where justice was sold to the highest bidder. A wealthy man could commit murder and walk free with a well-placed bribe, while a poor man could lose his home over a fabricated debt because he could not afford to pay the judge. The system, once a source of Roman pride and stability, became an instrument of plunder for the rich and a source of despair for the poor. The army, the very backbone of the empire, once the most disciplined and proud fighting force in the world, grew restless and corrupt. The legions stationed on the distant frontiers, far from the emperor's gaze, maintained some semblance of their old discipline out of habit. But in and around Rome, the Praetorian Guard, under the influence of powerful and greedy prefects like Clender, became a private army of thugs, more interested in intimidating the populace and extorting money than in protecting the state. With a commander-in-chief who was a performer, not a general, the traditional path to glory through military valor was closed. Ambitious officers saw that the way to advancement was not through courage on the battlefield, but through flattery in the palace. A deep cynicism took hold. The soldiers who remembered serving under the stoic, ever-present Marcus Aurelius on the cold German frontier looked upon his gladiator son with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. The practical management of the city, the intricate logistics that allowed a metropolis of over 1 million people to function, began to falter. Most critically, the grain supply, the annona, which fed the city's masses, became unstable. The officials in charge, having bought their positions, were more interested in enriching themselves by skimming profits than in ensuring the granaries were full. Shortages became more frequent. The price of bread, the staple food of the Roman poor, began to rise. This was a dangerous development. A hungry Roman mob was the most volatile and dangerous force in the empire, and its rumblings of discontent grew louder with each passing month. The city itself began to physically decay. Factions loyal to different chariot teams or gladiators rioted in the streets with increasing frequency, their brawls turning into bloody conflicts that the city watch was either unable or unwilling to control. Great fires broke out in the crowded tenement districts, and with no effective leadership to organize the response, they would rage for days, consuming vast swaths of the city and leaving thousands homeless. The Senate, the traditional governing body of the city, was utterly humiliated and powerless. They were a captive audience, forced to ratify the emperor's insane decrees and applaud his shameful performances, their authority a hollow echo of a bygone era. And still, through all of this, Commodus fought. The news of a riot in the city or a fire in the forum was a distant, annoying murmur, easily ignored. The reports from his administrators were tedious interruptions to his training schedule. He saw none of this as his responsibility. In his mind, these were the mundane, trivial concerns of mortals. He saw himself not as a ruler, not as a steward of the state, but as a myth made flesh. He was beyond politics, beyond administration, beyond duty. He truly and fervently believed that he was Hercules reborn, a divine being sent by the gods not to serve the Roman people, but to dazzle them. His purpose was not to govern, but to perform. His arena victories were, to him, far more important than any military victory on the frontier. His statues were more significant than any new aqueduct. His divine status was the ultimate end, and the empire was merely the stage upon which his apotheosis was enacted. The empire groaned beneath the immense, crushing weight of his ego. The intricate web of trust, duty, and tradition that had held the Roman world together for centuries was unraveling thread by thread. The stability that his father and the emperors before him had worked so hard to build was being squandered on a bloody, theatrical fantasy. The signs of impending collapse were everywhere, for anyone who dared to look. And in the shadows, people began to look. The failure of Lucilla's plot had been born of aristocratic pride and palace intrigue. But now, a new kind of conspiracy began to form, one born not of ambition, but of desperation. The men and women in the innermost circle of the palace, his chamberlains, his advisors, even his favorite concubine, had a unique vantage point. They saw the emperor's madness up close, every single day. They saw the reports he ignored, the duties he shirked. They understood, with a terrifying clarity, that the empire was on the brink of chaos. They realized that the ship of state was being steered directly toward an iceberg, and the captain was on the deck, preening for an imaginary crowd. Their own lives and fortunes were tied to the stability of the empire, and they saw that both were in mortal danger. A new plot began to form, not among senators in their villas, but in the quiet corridors of the palace itself, among the very people who served the god emperor his wine and drew his bath. They came to a grim conclusion. The only way to save Rome was to kill Hercules. It is New Year's Eve, the final, fateful night of the year 192 CE. A chill hangs in the Roman air, but inside the imperial palace, the atmosphere is thick with wine, sweat, and the feverish energy of a man on the verge of his ultimate self-deification. Commodus, drunk on victory and the adoration he has manufactured, is preparing for his grandest performance yet. The next day, the first of the new year, he will not enter the Senate as the head of state to inaugurate the new consuls. He will shun the ancient traditions of his office. Instead, he plans a dramatic entrance that will forever cement his living divinity. He will emerge from the gladiators' barracks, not the palace. He will march into the arena, not as an emperor presiding over the games, but as the star performer, the gladiator god. He will fight. He will win. He will be hailed as both the first gladiator and the first consul of the new year. The Roman state and the bloody sand of the arena will become one, and the world will have no choice but to bow before the Roman Hercules, the founder of the Colonia Commodiana. In his mind, it is the glorious culmination of his entire reign, the moment his myth becomes reality. But fate, and the few desperate people left in his inner circle, have other plans. The weight of his madness has finally become too much to bear. His most trusted chamberlain, the man who manages his household, Eclectus, the Praetorian prefect, Quintus Aemilius Letus, who commands his guards, and his favorite concubine, Marcia, the woman who shares his bed, have had enough. They have been the architects of his pleasure and the enablers of his fantasy, but they are also pragmatic survivors. They see the empire groaning, the treasury empty, and the loyalty of the army stretched to its breaking point. More acutely, they see the emperor's paranoia growing daily. They know his whims are deadly and that his favor is fleeting. They fear for their lives, and perhaps, in a final flickering sense of duty, they fear for Rome's. The plot is born of terror and self-preservation. Hercules must be slain before he devours them all. That night, the plan is set in motion. The first attempt is quiet, subtle, and feminine. Marcia, who often prepared the emperor's first cup of wine after his bath, takes on the role of assassin. She presents him with a poisoned goblet. The wine is drugged, the toxin chosen to be swift and sure. Commodus, thirsty and flushed with exertion from his evening exercises, takes the cup and drinks it down without suspicion. The conspirators retreat into the shadows, their hearts pounding, and wait for the poison to do its work. But the emperor's own excesses save him. His body, accustomed to vast quantities of wine and rich food, reacts violently. Whether it was the strength of his constitution or simply the effects of his drunkenness, he begins to vomit again and again, violently purging the poison from his system before it can fully take hold. He is sick, weakened, and confused, but he is alive. For the conspirators, this is a moment of pure terror. Their plot has failed, but their intent is now revealed. When Commodus recovers, his paranoia will become a certainty. He will know he has been betrayed, and his vengeance will be swift, imaginative, and agonizing. They've reached the point of no return. There can be no retreat. They must finish what they have started, and it must be done now, before the emperor has a chance to raise the alarm. A new, more brutal plan is hatched in a hurried, whispered conference. Poison has failed. They must now turn to steel, or something stronger. They need a man, someone with the strength and the nerve to confront the emperor in his private chambers. They summon Narcissus, a powerful wrestler who was employed as Commodus's personal training partner. He was the man who sparred with the emperor, who knew his strength, and who had the physical prowess to overcome it. They offer him a massive reward and, more importantly, the promise of their protection. Narcissus, knowing what will happen to him if Commodus survives, agrees. As Commodus stumbles from his bath, still weak and groggy from the effects of the wine and the failed poison, a man slips into his chamber. It is Narcissus. He is not armed with a sword or a dagger. He is a wrestler, a soldier in the art of pure physical force, an assassin whose weapons are his own hands. The scene is one of supreme and terrible irony. The emperor, the man who modeled himself on Hercules, the mythical hero famed for wrestling the Nemean lion and the giant Antaeus, is now faced with a real-life wrestling match to the death. There are no cheering crowds, no gilded weapons, no weakened opponents. There is only the dim flickering lamplight of the bedchamber, the smell of wine and vomit, and the silent, determined presence of a man sent to kill him. Commodus, perhaps believing this is part of a drunken training exercise, or perhaps too groggy to fully comprehend the threat, engages him. For a few desperate moments, the two powerful men struggle. The emperor, for all his training, is weakened and disoriented. Narcissus is strong, sober, and driven by the promise of reward and the fear of failure. He wraps his powerful hands around the emperor's throat. And just like that, the myth shatters. There is no divine strength, no Herculean power to save him. There is only the desperate animal struggle of a man fighting for air. The invincible gladiator, the living god, the conqueror of 1,000 beasts, is helpless. His struggles weaken. His face purples. The breath is squeezed from his body. The gladiator falls. Not in the glorious sand of the arena, not to the sound of a roaring crowd, but on the cold marble floor of his own bedroom, in silence at the hands of a servant. The reign that began with the quiet death of a philosopher ended with the quiet death of a performer. The great, noisy, brutal spectacle of Commodus was over. The stage was finally blessedly dark. Commodus was gone. The news of his death spread from the palace in hushed, incredulous whispers, which quickly grew into a torrent of rumor, and then, finally, a proclamation of fact. The god had fallen. The monster was dead. The Senate, that long-suffering body of men who had been forced to chant his blasphemous titles and applaud his shameful victories, rejoiced with a wild, almost hysterical glee. Their terror, a constant companion for over a decade, vanished in an instant, replaced by a surge of righteous fury. They convened immediately, and in a passionate, cathartic session, they unleashed all their pent-up hatred. They declared Commodus a public enemy, a tyrant, and a pariah. They decreed a damnatio memoria, the ultimate Roman punishment, the condemnation of memory. His name was to be chiseled off every monument, every archway, every public inscription. His statues, those ubiquitous marble figures of him as Hercules, were ordered to be toppled, dragged through the streets, and smashed to pieces. The goal was not just to kill the man, but to erase the very memory of his existence, to pretend the nightmare had never happened. The people of Rome, who had lived under the shadow of his unpredictable whims, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The fear that had stalked the city, the constant, low-level anxiety of what the emperor might do next, finally lifted. The great arenas, which had become the temples of his bloody cult, fell quiet. The silence that descended upon the Colosseum was more profound than any roar it had ever contained. The palace doors were thrown open. The conspirators quickly named a new emperor, a distinguished and elderly senator named Pertinax, hoping to restore the dignity and stability of a bygone era. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed as though the empire might heal. It seemed that Rome could simply sweep away the broken pieces of Commodus's reign and breathe again. But the damage remained. A wound so deep does not heal without a scar, and the wounds Commodus had inflicted upon the empire were mortal. His death did not mark a return to the golden age of his father. It marked the true and irreversible end of the Pax Romana, the long Roman peace that had been the empire's greatest achievement. The stability of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, that century of relative tranquility and prosperity, died with him on that cold marble floor. What followed was not peace, but chaos. The new emperor, Pertinax, was a good man, a throwback to the era of discipline and fiscal responsibility. But the city had been too deeply poisoned by corruption. When he tried to impose discipline on the Praetorian Guard, the very soldiers who had been enriched and empowered by Commodus's neglect, they balked. After just 87 days, they stormed the palace and murdered him. What they did next was an act of such profound cynicism it would have made Caligula blush. They put the Roman Empire up for auction. The throne of Augustus was sold to the highest bidder, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. This act triggered the final collapse. The legions on the frontiers, horrified that the Praetorians had sold the empire like common chattel, rose up in revolt. 3 powerful generals, Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus on the Danube, declared themselves emperor. The year 193 CE became the year of the 5 emperors, a brutal and bloody civil war that saw Roman armies marching against Roman armies, tearing the empire apart from within. The peace his father had died to protect was shattered, and the new era was one of shifting allegiances, brutal purges, and military anarchy. The empire had survived madmen before. It had endured the paranoia of Tiberius, the theatrical cruelty of Nero, and the divine fantasies of Caligula. After each of those reigns, the system had managed to right itself. The Senate had reasserted its authority, a new competent ruler had been found, and the core traditions of the state had been restored. But something had changed with Commodus. His predecessors, for all their flaws, were seen as aberrations, as monstrous exceptions to the rule. Commodus was different. He was the biological son of the best of emperors, the product of the very system of dynastic succession that was supposed to guarantee stability. His reign proved that the system itself was broken. He demonstrated that a man could inherit the world and feel no duty toward it whatsoever. More than that, Commodus fundamentally altered the nature of imperial power. He showed the world that Rome's crown could be worn not with the laurel wreath of a victorious general and the law of a wise statesman, but with the ego of a performer and the blood of the arena. He had severed the ancient connection between authority and responsibility. He taught the world that the emperor was not the first servant of the state, but its divine master, its greatest celebrity, its most celebrated killer. He had transformed the office from a magistracy into a personality cult. The military anarchy that followed his death was the logical consequence of his reign. The generals who fought for the throne were his true successors. They had learned his lesson well, that power no longer came from the Senate or the people, but from brute force and the loyalty of an army. The contest for the empire became a gladiatorial match on a global scale. The Civil War was not a political struggle. It was a battle for the title of the strongest man in the world. Commodus had shown them the way. The laurel and the law were forgotten. The new symbols of power were the sword, the ego, and the willingness to shed blood. The long, slow decline of the Western Roman Empire had begun. And now the sand has settled. The fine, blood-darkened grit of the arena floor, which swirled in chaotic clouds with every frantic footfall, now lies still and heavy in the moonlight. The great tiered stands of the Colosseum, which once thundered with the roar of 100,000 voices, are empty. The wind, as it whispers through the silent archways, carries no echoes of the crowd's roar or the clash of steel. It carries only the cool, clean scent of the Roman night and the dust of ages. The show is over. The crowd has left. The emperor lies still. The man who saw himself as a god, who believed his body was the vessel for the immortal Hercules, is now just flesh and bone, growing cold beneath a thin layer of earth and moss. The powerful muscles have gone slack. The arrogant eyes are closed forever. His final, desperate struggle in the lamplit quiet of his bedchamber was his last performance, and it had an audience of one, his assassin. There is no more applause, no more fear, no more worship. There is only the immense democratic silence of the grave, a silence that comes for emperors and gladiators alike. What remains of Commodus? What is left when the statues are toppled and the inscriptions are erased? A name that has become a byword for a particular kind of tyranny, not the cold, calculating paranoia of Tiberius, nor the theatrical madness of Caligula, but the tyranny of decadent, self-absorbed neglect. It is the tyranny of a man who inherited the world and, finding it boring, decided to set it on fire for his own amusement. A myth, the myth of the gladiator emperor, the Roman Hercules. It is a story so potent, so bizarre, that it has outlived the empire itself. It speaks to a timeless fascination with the corruption of power, with the spectacle of a man who has everything and finds it is not enough. He is the ultimate cautionary tale of the leader who falls in love with his own reflection and forgets the people he is meant to serve. And a lesson written in the blood of civil war and the slow decay of an empire. The lesson is that stability is fragile, that institutions are only as strong as the character of those who lead them, and that when a nation begins to worship celebrity over substance, strength over wisdom, and spectacle over duty, it is on a path to ruin. But who was the man at the center of this myth, this lesson? Some say he was simply mad. that his mind was a broken thing, shattered by the pressures of his office or some latent flaw in his character. They see his obsession with the arena not as a choice, but as the symptom of a profound psychosis, a complete detachment from reality. Others say he was not mad, but merely spoiled in a way the world had never before seen. He was the boy who was never told no. He was born at the absolute pinnacle of human power, and his every whim was indulged, his every desire met. He was, in this view, a child who never grew up, a petulant teenager with the world as his plaything. His cruelty was not the product of a diseased mind, but of a stunted heart, incapable of empathy because it had never known struggle. And some believe he was neither mad nor merely spoiled, but that he was, in his own strange way, a brilliant performer. They believe he simply played the role the world gave him, the handsome, heroic son of a beloved philosopher, and he played it too well. He understood that the empire ran on spectacle, that the masses craved heroes and gods. He gave them what they wanted, becoming the ultimate celebrity. Perhaps he started by playing the part of Hercules, but the roar of the crowd was so intoxicating, the performance so all-consuming, that he lost himself within it. The mask became the man, and he could no longer distinguish between the Emperor Commodus and the demigod of the arena. He was an actor who became so lost in his role that he burned down the theater with everyone inside. But now, as sleep draws close and the demands of the waking world begin to fade, we can leave these questions to the historians. We can leave the roar of the arena behind. Our journey with this emperor is at an end. Let the echoes fade. Let the sound of the crowd, whether cheering in fear or adoration, dissolve into the quiet of the past. Let the gold grow dim, the shimmering light of his gilded armor, the glint of his jeweled collars, the opulence of his corrupt court. Let it all tarnish and be covered by the dust of centuries. Let Rome rest. The city has survived him. It has survived fires, plagues, civil wars, and a long line of both good and terrible men. It will survive this too. Its 7 hills have absorbed the stories of countless lives, and they will hold this one too in their deep earthen memory. We can close our eyes, not on a scene of chaos, but on one of profound and final peace. The peace of a story told, of a life concluded, of a historical chapter closed. The night is deep. It is the deep, starless night of history, where the clamor of a single life is absorbed into an immense and profound silence. The concerns that seemed so monumental, the hatreds that felt so all-consuming, the ambitions that seemed to shake the world, they are all now quiet. The story is done. Next time, if you wish, we can follow the trail of yet another dark figure, or return to the reigns of those emperors who brought light instead of fire. But tonight we rest. Close your eyes, traveler. History sleeps beside you. Good night.